Are you watching closely? My inclination for how to start the stream, which I was just talking about, Jared, was if I could put up a totally black screen to start off before the countdown, and I was going to say that, but I couldn't like figure out a way to do that quickly. But
it was the only way to start the stream was with that quote. If you weren't going to do it, I was going to do it. So yeah. Glad we got that in
there. Welcome everybody to another Cinematic Realms. We're your hosts, John Webster and
Jared Kozel.
Today we're doing we're veering over to Mr. Christopher Nolan, and you remarked about the fact that we're kind of covering some of our this is kind of like a quasi Oscar special couple of weeks because we're touching on some directors who are likely to be nominated this year. This week we're doing Christopher Nolan, and then next week we're doing Mr. Martin Scorsese. So yeah, this week we're talking about a little movie, called The Prestige, which came out in 2006. And I do have to say, like, I'm thinking, I was thinking a lot about this today as I was watching it. It's so weird to kind of go back to this era of Christopher Nolan because this was right after Batman Begins. Mm-hmm. And Christopher Nolan was still very much known, I think, to a lot of people as it's the guy who did Memento, because Memento was such a seismic event, in the film community. And another thing that's struck me about that is the fact that, growing up, speaking of Scorsese, I think we came into, a lot of us came into our love of film hearing of these, auteur directors and, their, filmography and stuff. And I realized that I'm there's probably others. I mean, I guess there are others, if I think about it real hard, but, with the exception of Following, which was his first independent film, I know for me, the fact that I kind of got to see Christopher Nolan, at his beginning, with Memento, which was his big entrance, it kind of feels good to recognize that I have like this ground level appreciation for this, acclaimed, astonishing director. And it, shows that he's kind of, I think for our generation, one of those greats that, I don't think I had expected to ever have the experience of growing up knowing, the filmography of one of these kinds of directors and seeing them from their early stages until they're doing, now with Oppenheimer, which is just one of the greatest pieces of cinema I think that's ever been created, and has a lot of qualities in, similar qualities with this film, I think, as I was watching. So I don't know. It's just one of those things that, I joked about, before we started the stream. I talked about, the fact that I keep bringing it up. Oh, it's, we're getting close to 20 years for this one. And it's another opportunity for me to feel old, but also it's an opportunity to kind of reflect and be like, it's amazing to have seen how far Nolan has come over the years. And yet, as far as I'm concerned, he was, that brilliance was at the forefront, from the earliest. But yeah, I'm just sort of rambling, but but I don't know. You have any thoughts along those lines?
I have a lot, particularly related to Christopher Nolan and the time that this movie came out. But first, you started the stream with a question. I have a question for you.
Okay.
What knot did you tie?
I don't know. I'm not sure.
How can you not know?
I'm sorry, Robert. I don't know.
I'm kidding, but yeah, we'll get into that. But specifically with regard to like first experiences with this film and its place within Christopher Nolan's filmography, there's so much to delve into because this movie is really kind of a fascinating marker in his filmography. As you said, his first ever movie was, oh yes, it is indeed Batman v Wolverine. Probably, that is a lot of what got a lot of people into the theater, and then they got a very different kind of movie. But Christopher Nolan, his first movie, as you alluded to, is this kind of micro budget thriller following, which, if anyone hasn't seen, I think is actually available for free on YouTube with ads. It's an interesting film because it kind of it's very low budget, but it's very narratively tight, and a lot of the hallmarks that you would associate with Christopher Nolan movies later are kind of present there. There's even a character named Cobb for an Inception link.
Well, it's interesting because it's the it's the black hole in my in my love of Christopher Nolan. Somehow I have avoided going back to see Following, which is it's so shameful. As much as I love his movies.
What I would say is the movie's 70 minutes, so it's a pretty quick watch, again, for free with ads on YouTube. It's worth watching, and it's an interesting movie to watch after you've seen the rest of his films because, again, it's kind of like a proving ground. It's probably qualitatively at the bottom of his 12-movie filmography for me, but at the same time, as we said on the Oppenheimer stream, Nolan doesn't miss, at least for me, so it's still like, as a first feature, it's pretty astonishing at how, well crafted it is. But as you alluded to, he really kind of got his independent break with Memento in 2000. Then he did Insomnia in 2002, which is kind of a movie that when people think of Christopher Nolan movies, they don't always associate that one with him because it's kind of a little bit more of a studio film. It's a remake. It is the only movie in his filmography on which he does not have a screenplay credit. Mm-hmm. And it's good. It's, excellent performances from Al Pacino and Robin Williams, the late Robin Williams, and Hilary Swank.
It's been a while. It's been a while since I've seen it. As a matter of fact, I may have only seen it once in the theater. But the main thing I remember from that was, oh my God, Robin Williams is just utterly amazing, and he was scary.
Yeah, he's a different type of character than he usually does in that movie. Yeah. But for most people, Nolan's big breakout outside of the independent film world with Memento was his Batman film, Batman Begins, in 2005. That was the first movie of his that I ever saw. And I saw it because it was a Batman movie, not because it was a Christopher Nolan movie. And I love that movie. I think it is great. It's one of the best Batman films. I mean, there have been a lot of good ones, but what was interesting about this film specifically with The Prestige is this is the movie that came between Batman Begins, which was Nolan's kind of big breakout, and The Dark Knight, which was literally a phenomenon that took the world by storm and made him a household name. And it's a movie that he had in the works basically ever since since he made Memento. It actually went through a couple different filmmakers. It's based on a book, which we can talk about. It's a 1995 book by Christopher Priest that I believe won several awards, including the Arthur C. Clarke Award for Science Fiction and Fantasy. But what's interesting about it, among many other things, is that at the time, it was the follow-up to Batman Begins, and it did well, but it didn't, light the world on fire. It came out, and coincidentally enough, as these things do, in the same year, 2006, as not one actually, as I originally remembered, but two other magician movies. The first of them, which
what was the other one? Because I know The Illusionist was
so
one.
the Illusionist is the one that people remember. That one stars Edward Norton and Paul Giamatti and Jessica Biel. It's actually good, not as good as this movie in my opinion. But
I've always really liked it, and I think that they're two really great pieces to watch together, because I think that Christopher Nolan's movie is the more cerebral of the two, and is obviously stunningly constructed, as every Christopher Nolan movie is, and The Illusionist has a lot of heart, which is why I actually quite love that film. And so I don't like comparing the two, but when you're up against Christopher Nolan, it's like
time has not served that comparison well, even though I agree. I actually quite liked The Illusionist. I actually haven't seen it since that initial watch. I could probably do with a rewatch. The other movie is almost not worth mentioning. It's actually the one that came out first in that summer of that year. It's called Scoop. It's a Woody Allen movie. And it stars Hugh Jackman and Scarlett Johansson, which is why it's worth mentioning. It's a very different kind of movie from what I understand. I have not seen it. I probably never will. One, because it's not the most well received, and two, I just don't like Woody Allen movies for a lot of reasons. I've liked one that I can remember. But regardless, I just say that to point out that these things weirdly came in threes, not twos, and Scoop and Illusionist have kind of a little bit faded into the background. Again, The Illusionist it's good, but it's not really like talked about as much, whereas I feel like what I'm building to is this movie and Christopher Nolan's filmography did not get a lot of acclaim when it first came out, but over time, it has really started to rise in people's estimations to the point that a lot of people consider it one of his best movies. And watching it back, you can actually, I actually think I might agree. This movie has climbed up my personal estimation, not only just as a film in general, but as a Christopher Nolan movie. I think this one is actually pretty immaculate in terms of its craftsmanship, even though it's a very dark movie.
Yeah, it's always perplexing for me trying to figure out how, and I hate ranking. I really do. I get pulled into doing it every year, but I, with the movies that come out each year, and I'm always so dissatisfied with how that makes me feel. But when it comes to Christopher Nolan movies, I'm like, oh, don't make me. But and the reason why I say that is because as a Batman fan, like, he has just made some of the greatest, Batman. Everybody, with good reason, always raves about The Dark Knight, but I love Batman Begins so much, because I think that film does something that the other ones don't, in that it's so focused on Bruce Wayne, and in a way that I think the others aren't quite as much, because they have more, there's more characters to cover, and especially Dark Knight is it's so overwhelmed by Heath Ledger as the Joker. As masterful as that film is, it's I quite like the sort of more not quiet, but there's something a bit more reserved about Batman Begins that I love, and I love stuff like Gordon driving around the Batmobile and all that fun stuff. And Liam Neeson, Liam Neeson always makes everything so much better. But The Prestige has always kind of been the one that, when the latest Christopher Nolan movie has been out for a while, and my list kind of settles down a bit, The Prestige always tends to rise back up towards the top. So I think it may be my favorite of his films. But I just think it's so masterful because the whole film itself is like, a magic trick. It's so brilliantly conceived. And someone mentioned the trailer for this film earlier. And I actually wonder how involved Nolan was in the promotion of the film, because I feel like the trailer is part of the narrative of like how this film came out, because there's two great things about the trailer for this movie. One is the way it's constructed. It brilliantly uses the 3-act notion of a magic trick to tell its story. What's the first act, the pledge, and then it gets to the middle of the trailer and says, then there's the turn. That's the part with the twists and turns and lives hang in the balance, and it amps things up, and then that's why there's a final act called The Prestige, and that's the climax of the trailer. It so brilliantly uses that as the structure for the actual trailer. It's one of those trailers that, for me, along with things like the trailers for Lord of the Rings, it's a piece of art onto itself. It's so wonderfully constructed. But the other part that's brilliant about the marketing for this film is the trailer builds up Borden as someone who can do real magic, and gets you as an audience primed for, the big reveal of this movie is that Borden not doing any tricks. He actually, is like a supernatural being of some kind and can do real magic. And that's a complete diversion within the actual movie that ends up, not being the case at all. And so I have to imagine that Nolan was, involved, with sort of building that up. And I just, normally I don't think I go on about the promotion of a film so much, but it's just like, it was so utterly brilliant for this film.
Obi Brown in the chat was shouting out the trailer, Prestige having one of the best trailers. So thank you for that, Obi. It's Christopher Nolan films tend to have good trailers. It's easier to do when your movie has the goods, as his movies always do. But what's specifically interesting about that trailer and how it leads into the movie is, one, as you said, the movie kind of the trailer does a little bit of a sleight of hand like the movie does, in the sense of building up the idea that Borden has these potentially supernatural powers, which he actually doesn't. But also, as you point out, the best trailers are the kind of trailers that tell you what the movie is and what kind of movie it's going to be, without, lying to you effectively, or lying in the right way, shall we say, not telling you everything, but also kind of giving you a sense of what kind of movie that you're in for. And then also it's a kind of the way it kind of lays out its stakes right from the beginning, because the speech, Cutter's speech, Michael Caine's character, that kind of forms the spine of that trailer, describing the 3 acts of the magic trick, the pledge, the turn, and the prestige. That is literally how the movie opens, other than that one, that very brief shot that you alluded to of all the hats in the field with Borden saying, "Are you watching closely?" and then it cutting to black. The next thing we see is Michael Caine's character giving us this kind of expository speech about the nature of a magic trick and the structure of it, and how that is actually going to inform how we watch the rest of the movie. And as we'll get to, of course, it comes back in the end, at the very end, in the most beautiful and haunting and devastating way.
I don't want to get to the final reveal quite
not
yet, just because if by some chance we get anybody watching this who has not seen the movie, I want to give them a little bit of conversation before we completely spoil the big reveal. Just so they have a chance to maybe leave. This is one movie that you do not want to have things spoiled for you. But yeah, no, I talked about it on our last stream. That opening with the hats is just, and the very quick, are you watching closely? And then cutting away. It does. It sets you on edge for it sets you on edge for the rest of the movie, but it also puts you sort of on the back foot because you're like, oh shit, I was supposed to be paying attention. What did I miss? And yeah, it's just, it's great because, and I can't speak for other people, but I know my experience watching this movie was just from that point on, I was like, I know there's, stuff that, by the very nature of this movie, it's playing a sleight of hand, but I couldn't quite figure out what that was. And then by the time we get to the end of the film, I was gobsmacked. Maybe some people figured out where this was leading. Maybe they picked up on some things. I'm happy to claim myself as an idiot if that's the case, because I was just completely floored by where this film goes. But before we get to all of that, I mentioned before there's similarities with this film compared to Oppenheimer, which I only really noticed going back to this film now. Obviously, Christopher Nolan is well known for his nonlinear storytelling, but I feel like this film really has so much in common with the sort of narrative structure of Oppenheimer in the fact that it cuts back and forth between different points of view in different time periods. There's like early on in this film, we get, the present time, I guess we'd call it. And then Borden is reading, Angier's journal, which is Angier recounting reading Borden's journal. And so there's just so many layers of, of different, these different characters telling their stories within stories. And the fact that the movie just, it works. It like, you don't get lost watching it. It's just, so masterfully crafted. And I think that's why it might be my favorite of his films, because it seems like it's you kind of take it for granted because everything Nolan does kind of feels so assured and like he has complete control. But this film, it's so audacious in its storytelling, and it just feels like with a less talented director, this could go, this could go off the road very, very easily, and you'd be like, wait, what's going on? But somehow he just makes it all work so beautifully.
Yeah, there's kind of like a meta narrative around this movie and a lot of Christopher Nolan movies that I'm aware of but try not to subscribe to, which is the idea that his movies are kind of about the filmmaking process itself, because he's a very like technically oriented, smart, very like focused director who knows exactly what he wants to do, and the kind of the art of craftsmanship itself kind of works its way into the narrative. I don't think that's actually what this movie about. I don't think he set out to make the idea of like, I'm going to make a movie about making movies. I think it's more the idea that he resonated with some of the similar aspects of craftsmanship that go into being a meticulous artist, total devotion to one's art, as they allude to in the movie, and we see throughout the characters' journeys. But I don't think that's the point of the movie. I think this movie is much more about, and we'll talk about the themes, things like obsession, secrecy, the personal cost of, being totally devoted to one's art, the ideas of sacrifice, rivalry, escalation. This movie is incredibly thematically rich, and it's got very well drawn, characters. And it just happens to be that the actual craftsmanship of the movie itself, lends itself very well to like the meticulous nature of the characters in how they are crafting their tricks, specifically with Borden and his like total devotion to the way he constructs his trick, and in particular for Angier, the idea of it's not just the craftsmanship, it's not just the technical aspect of it, it's the showmanship part of it too. It's not just what it's about, it's how it's about it. And Angier is, we'll talk about, because class is another theme of this movie, a very important one. Angier, being the more from an aristocratic background, is very much more of the showman. And he freely acknowledges later in the movie at the very end that he was never the pure magician that Borden was, but he was a better salesman, effectively, and he was a better, had greater ostentatious presentation, whereas Borden was much more about the craft. And this movie does both. This movie is very tight, meticulous, crafted, the way everything links back to itself, but it's also incredibly entertaining. That's part of it. Like, it's not just like, oh, I can see what they're doing there. You're like, it goes right into the idea. It's like, there's a trick, there's a way that this is being done. It's not pure magic. There's science to it, but you aren't looking for the trick because you want to be fooled. And this movie draws you in, and then it shows you what it thinks, what you think you need to know, and then it pulls the rug out from under you, and then you're like, I think I get it now. And the movie's like, no, you don't. But it always plays fair. That's the other thing. It's not like there is no deus ex machina in this movie. From the very beginning, it's one of the reasons this movie is so rewarding on a rewatch, is because you can see when you go back and watch it again how everything was set up, and it was set up so perfectly. And this is the kind of movie where knowing the twist doesn't remove the drama from it. If anything, it enhances it.
Yeah, it's that was another thing I noticed going back to watch this today, is it's amazing how, we get the end of the movie at the beginning of the movie, but just, there's a couple things being held back, but it's just so amazing how much is actually shown to us. We just don't know all the pieces yet. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that right there is a difference between the magic tricks and filmmaking. If we're drawing that comparison, is that Borden says once people the secret is everything, and then once that's gone, nobody will be amazed. But we go back and we watch this, and the fact that we know what happened actually just makes the film all the more intriguing, because we can go back and link everything together, and it's just so amazing to watch. And I think that's, when it comes to cinema, that's why I always say rewatches are so rewarding, because if the film is really, really good, because there's a pleasure in piecing everything together in a way that's different from that initial viewing when you are completely caught off guard. There's an excitement there. Completely different kind of movie, but I compare it to the climax of Knives Out, and pretty much any other sort of really good murder mystery, is that even once like who did it, that whole sequence where Blanc is telling the story of, and how he's figuring all that out. It is supremely entertaining every time you go back to it. And same thing with this. We may know like how everything connects together now and the secret, but it doesn't make it any less thrilling to watch. It's even more so.
Does that make Tesla the donut hole of this movie?
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, Guilty made this time, but I would actually say Tesla is the one who who has the real magic, which is really just science in the world of this film. I not quite sure whether whether science could deliver what we've seen, but that's like the part of the joy of this world that's created is like we don't even care about the plausibility of that. It's real in this world, and we don't doubt it for a second.
Yeah, and specifically the comment that Guilty Undertaker made about sufficiently advanced technology being indistinguishable from magic, which is a powerful thematic idea. And it plays into the idea of Tesla's character because and his role in this movie, because he plays very kind of like a mythical role in his presence. He's not in the movie very much, but he's incredibly important. And Christopher Nolan actually talks about this in the behind the scenes elements of the movie. The idea that, Tesla was rightly lauded as a genius inventor, but he was kind of not the greatest salesman for his own work. And Thomas Edison, who probably did not have exactly the same scientific acumen, even though he is more widely acclaimed, was probably the better salesman. I believe Edison once said, invention is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. And we see agents of Edison in this movie as kind of like jealous of Tesla's work and trying to tear him down. Whereas Tesla is much more of like, he plays this kind of element where he is kind of floating above the movie in the way because he is the one who brings the magic into it in the form of incredibly advanced science. But he also doesn't have the same, he also is a little bit of more of a moral conscience for the movie. Mm-hmm. And this is a great opportunity, as you're putting these pictures up on the screen, to mention that Tesla is, of course, played by the iconic David Bowie.
I was just waiting to see if you were going to mention it, or
well, I mean, we have to, because as Christopher Nolan alludes to, he very much was the only choice for the part, and he had to kind of sell him hard on that idea to get him to play the role, which he does brilliantly. Yes, I love Bowie too. R.I.P.
I will say it's very funny because I am not like, you guys know me. My love of music is rooted in classical music, film scores. So like, obviously I know of David Bowie. Like everybody knows of David Bowie, but I've never been like a concentrated like listener of his music, or I definitely wouldn't be able to claim to being a fan, even though I know how great he was. So my knowledge of Bowie actually comes from his few film appearances, and probably most notably this, because I only just recently saw Labyrinth for the first time, even though I obviously knew he was in it. So it's just so funny having that perspective on Bowie, and like, he's phenomenal in this, even though, as you said, he's only in a few scenes, but oh my God, what an impression he makes. He's so good. And I'm always gutted because he was really close to, he was actually cast in Blade Runner 2049 as what's the antagonist's name?
Neander Wallace, is that
Wallace?
Character?
Yeah, he was going to play Wallace, and then sadly he passed away. And
that would have made an already near perfect movie even more perfect.
yeah, I actually think, whatever you think about Jared Leto on a personal level, I think he did really good in the role. And he's scary, and I thought he was very effective. But oh my God, Bowie in that role, it just went, oh.
Yeah, I think I might have been literally levitating in the theater because I was already pretty close, and that might have just tipped it over the edge. But tying it back into the idea of like the scientific innovation, one of the things about Bowie that Christopher Nolan mentioned in the behind the scenes was because Bowie was a little bit more reclusive and didn't have the same salesman elements, and like was also kind of persecuted a little bit because of his immigrant background. He had a lot of inventions that he created, he patented, and he never released, either because he thought the world wasn't ready for him, or he just knew that they wouldn't understand it. And and that we kind of see elements of that in the movie, like people don't always understand his alternating current and the fact that it's safe because it looks dangerous. But with him, part of Nolan's ability to bring in the one actually truly fantastical, as in like science fiction, like magical element of the movie through Tesla comes with the idea that Tesla invented all these things that that never saw the light of day and may, and have kind of been lost to history. Who's to say he couldn't have done something like this? I don't personally think he created a device of this nature, but he was a man who was ahead of his time and kind of out of his time in many of his ways. And as Bowie himself, or as Tesla says in the movie, the world can only handle one advancement at a time. And the first time I changed the world, they hailed me as a visionary. The second time I changed the world, they politely asked me to retire. And here I am enjoying my retirement, kind of sadly and a little bit bitterly there. But as we see, and as we'll get into more when we start talking more about the actual nature of the machine that Tesla ultimately builds for Angier, he was a man who was capable of extraordinary things. And part of the reason that he didn't end up changing the world as much as he probably could have was, at least in this movie's telling, he chose not to, because unlike Borden to a certain extent, and definitely unlike Angier by the end, there were lines that he was not willing to cross. Even though he had the similar idea of like an obsessive nature to him, he mentions that he's kind of a slave to his obsessions, and at some point they will choose to destroy me, but he also understands I will not choose to use them to destroy others, which is ultimately something that both Borden and Angier end up doing with the tragedy that they inflict upon others and then ultimately themselves.
There's so much that I just love about everything that transpires in Colorado Springs with Tesla. The fact that it comes out that that Borden never went to Tesla and Tesla never built something, and the fact that he just builds it for Angier, this very thing that this mythical machine. He's like, yeah, okay, I'll make it. Which, by the way, like, it's funny. We're talking about minor characters before we really dig deep into the main characters. But I can't help it when you just have these amazing actors. But I also want to mention Andy Serkis, who plays Mr. Alley, who's Tesla's assistant. And this was back in their like early days after, just a couple years after Lord of the Rings had come out. So a lot of people weren't yet familiar with, Andy Serkis, the live action actor. And I just remember jumping out of my seat when I saw him. I was just so happy.
Yeah. He was like a nice little discovery for me on my second watch, because when I first watched this movie back in 2006, I mean, I saw Andy Serkis. I kind of knew it was Andy Serkis, but it didn't really like stick in my memory. And then when I went back and watched the movie, I'm like, Andy Serkis. So.
Yeah, no, it's great. And again, he doesn't have that much in the movie, but yeah, he makes the most of it. And even more so like now, you know, I was talking about taking sort of the full breadth of Christopher Nolan's filmography into consideration. I just love that these actors, you know, have had a place in Nolan's filmography, this sort of rich tapestry where all these actors come in and play. Like, it's just so great. Anyway, so let's
you want to go back to the beginning, or as close as we can get to the beginning, let's say.
Yeah, like, so we haven't really talked about what the plot of this movie is, just sort of like vaguely making references to some weird shit that goes on. But the movie starts off with, you know, we have these two magicians, Angier and Borden, who are, sort of learning things together, part of the same troupe, you know, and something happens.
We can say it. We already made an allusion to it with the what not did you tie joke, or I did, but
yeah, besides we're 40 minutes in, and this is a fairly early spoiler, so I think we should go ahead and you know.
Yeah. So effectively, they're working as shills in the classical sense, not, you know, the shills the way that the people use the word today, but they work for this magician who's actually played by the late Ricky Jay, who was himself actually a trained magician in addition to being an actor.
And another one of those actors who you've seen in so many things, you know, great character actor, and another one I'm getting in the way of myself mentioning, you know, the smaller parts of this movie, but the great Roger Rees has a role in this as well, as he's a solicitor for a Lord Carlo, who will
Caldlow, yes. We'll get to him, because
but I just wanted to shout him out because I was such a fan of Roger Rees. He's well known to a lot of people. He was the sheriff of Rottingham in Robin Hood Men in Tights, but he also had roles on I think he's really well known for, he had a recurring role on Cheers, and he was also in a few episodes of The West Wing where he played the British ambassador. So hilarious in that, but like dramatically really great too. So yeah, I just wanted to give him a shout out. It's not a big part in this movie, but anytime he shows up in something, I was very happy. And unfortunately, he's passed away. But yeah, he's great.
Yeah, as has Ricky Jay. There are a lot of, you know, it's part of the excellent craftsmanship of this movie that even the smaller roles are inhabited by very distinguished actors. But playing into the idea of like the young stars of the movie who kind of are on their way up, the movie effectively, it starts with tragedy, we can say, because we alluded to the fact that Angier and Borden, coming from very different backgrounds, Angier kind of from an aristocratic background who's hiding his own identity, and Borden, who is also hiding his identity but comes from a more working class background. They both work for this guy, this kind of safe older magician, Milton the Magnificent, I believe, and they don't like each other, but they're colleagues. They have kind of a cordial working relationship, and maybe a little bit of a burgeoning rivalry, but not anything that you would think would lead to all the tragedy and death that comes later. But the tragedy starts because Angier's wife, Julia, played by the lovely Piper Perabo, she is also part of the act, and she and Borden kind of have a desire to push things a little bit more than Cutter, who also works for Milton, wants them to. And their decision that Julia kind of assents to, and that Borden is kind of pushing for, to try a different knot in the water tank trick, one that is a higher degree of difficulty and is also a little bit more secure, which ostensibly would be safer for the hoist of getting her into the water tank. But as Cutter warns them, it's not a knot you can easily slip, and especially underwater. So yes, again, the costumes in this movie are excellent.
Oh my God, yeah.
But they're not the typical period costumes, shall we say? They're much more modern in their style, which we can talk about later. But just to get to the heart of it, the idea that effectively the trick goes wrong and Julia drowns in rather terrible and tragic fashion because she and Borden make the decision to tie a different knot. And it devastates Angier, understandably so. But he has incredible antipathy towards Borden for this. It would understandably, in the sense of, he asked Borden the question, "What knot did you tie? I thought we agreed we weren't going to try this." And if Borden had simply been able, shall we say, to give him the right answer of, yes, we did try this knot. She and I agreed on trying this knot. It ended terribly. I take responsibility. I am so, so sorry. Would Angier have had the same grudge born? I'm sure he wouldn't necessarily have been happy, but he might have understood it, because the thing that Borden tells him is not, yes, we tied that knot, or not even, no, I didn't tie that knot, and why? I don't know. And that question, that horrifying question, like, torments Angier, the idea of, you don't know. How can you not know? And it starts him on this obsessive search for, one, for answers, and two, to destroy this man who, as he feels, has stolen his happiness in so many ways.
Yeah. Oh God. And what follows is just such a destructive story of these two men who, it's never enough. They continually have to, one up each other, and from Angier's point of view, he won't be satisfied until he's completely destroyed Borden. He's not even happy when the act that they start doing later is a success. And so much to the point that later in the film it even stops being about his wife. I think one of the most terrifying lines of the movie it is when and we'll talk about her shortly, Scarlett Johansson's character, Olivia, when she says, "This won't bring your wife back," and he says, "I don't care about my wife. I care about his trick." It's like, and then he realizes instantly like what he's said, but just the way he says that, it's like, oh my God, look how far you've fallen. Yeah. Dude, and he just, unfortunately, he keeps falling from there.
And the tragedy of it is, or one of the many tragedies is, it's not clear to us, and it's not essentially meant to be clear to us, when exactly that obsession overtook his love and grief, or if it was born out of it, or if it was twisted by it. It kind of becomes an Ouroboros in that way, because as Cassie points out in the chat here, the real gut punch wasn't even his final ending, but the idea about the anecdote that Cutter tells him about the former sailor who drowned, and who tells him, he said it was like going home. It's a thing that's supposed to be comforting to Angier, and the idea that perhaps Julia didn't suffer as much as it appeared she was suffering when she was drowning in the tank. But a very small scene, like right after that tragedy happens, is we actually see Angier face down in like an overflowing sink, like holding himself there, like trying to feel some element of what his wife was feeling in that moment. And it's not peaceful, you know. He can't do it. He holds himself there as long as he can, and then he throws himself back, like gasping and choking in like terror. And it's because, as Heather Waiter like spitefully tells Angier the truth, drowning is not peaceful and set and, you know, and quiet, and drowning is agony.
Well, and as we'll get into shortly, we'll save it for after the mid-roll, but there's, you know, that's a double gut punch for an entirely different reason.
Yeah.
But
and because as you allude to, Angier in some element is trying to reforge that connection to his wife and like experience some element of, you know, the way that she was lost to him, trying to regain what was lost in that way. But it turns, it becomes such a dark, twisted, horrible way for him to torture himself, in not only physically but mentally as well. And what's interesting about it in the class sense, I think we mentioned, Ed Caldwell, you know, or as I should say, Angier, you know, coming from an aristocratic background, it's not clear to me whether or not his wife Julia knows about his true identity, but the relationship early in the movie does seem to be one of genuine love. It could be that they met, you know, as part of this act and they fell in love, and so she was an element of his life that kind of tied him a little bit more to the humanity rather than his obsession. And when she's lost, he just goes down a dark hole almost willingly, from which he ultimately can't escape.
Yeah. And again, so much is laid down in front of us. It's like, you know, I don't want to go into details yet, but you know, we get references early on to what's the name again? Lord
Caldwell.
Caldwell. And then in a flash, you know, in the first of many, you know, flashbacks, you know, to the early days, you know, of all this, we see him talking with, you know, Julia and talk about how he changed his name, you know, to avoid embarrassing his family. And it's like, it's all right there, but we just haven't put it together yet. Oh God, it's, I'm just going to say it a million times. This film is just masterfully pieced together. And it's one of the things that, and again, I'm kind of holding off on unleashing too much, but we can say that on first viewing of this movie, the character of Borden is he's a difficult man to understand because he's someone who seems very at odds with himself, and that makes it very difficult to view him in a sympathetic light. And the reason why I mention that is because also Angier, he starts off sympathetic, but but then the further along in the movie we go, the further down he goes, and so it's very hard to have much sympathy for either of these men. But there are things being held back about Borden, which we'll get to shortly, which turns the movie on its head. Doesn't make everything he does all that great, but it does open it. That's why I talked about going back to see this movie a second time is so rewarding because there's so much more about these characters than you do on your first way through the movie.
And specifically to that point that you raised, there is not necessarily a hero and the villain of this piece.
No,
the two leads of this movie, Angier and Borden, are not the most sympathetic of gentlemen. They're actually there are a few sympathetic characters in the movie. Sarah would be one. Heather, I think, would be another. Even Olivia to a certain extent. She also has more of her. She's more willingly involved in the games that are going on between the two, even though she also has her own reservations. But the idea that there's not a hero and a villain, there's really just an escalating, rivalry and a back and forth. And at the point we start the story, our sympathies lean towards Angier in the beginning, or at least mine did, because the first real gut punch that we get in the movie is when Angier loses his wife, Julia, who he really did seem to authentically love. And as we see, it is at least in part Borden's fault that she dies. So that naturally codes our sympathies towards Angier a little bit more.
And even before that, because Angier starts off the movie having been killed.
Well, yes, that too, and as you noted, the movie kind of holds Borden a little bit more at a remove than it does Angier, in part to preserve the nature of the twist that we will discuss eventually, and others are talking about in the comments already. But the idea is that the movie tends to stick us a little bit more with Angier's perspective, because the central driving thrust of the plot is Angier's obsession and need to not only, better Borden and get revenge on Borden, and to discover ultimately the nature of his trick, but also, effectively, the loss of his wife. He's trying to, make up for that. And so our sympathies are with Angier in that extent. But then it also shows us Borden in jail, rotting away in jail, ostensibly for Angier's murder. And we are like, how should we be feeling about this? Are we good, he's going to be brought to justice, or is there more to the story? It's the latter, ultimately. But that doesn't mean that Borden is blameless. As we see, he does his own. He at the start, he's more willing to get his hands dirty than Angier is, and that has terrible consequences for him and for his personal life. But there ultimately comes to a point where there is a line that Borden, or at least part of Borden, shall we say, isn't willing to cross, and Angier blows right by that line. And the fact that our sympathies are coded with Angier in the beginning makes it all the more unsettling to us when we start to realize, I'm not actually rooting for this guy anymore. Who the hell am I rooting for?
And yet we are still with him in those last moments of the movie, not in a way that, yes, it's kind of it's the Walter White thing where, we recognize that this character has just completely descended into villainy, but we're at least still understanding him. Mm-hmm. And so we're with him in those moments, and it completely checks everything that he says of what's driven him to all this, which feels like a good place to pause for the mid-roll, so that when we come back, we can take the shackles off and just go all into the stuff. So we're talking about Christopher Nolan this week. Next week, we're going over to Mr. Martin Scorsese, talking about a personal favorite of mine, Hugo, which he made in 2011. And which, even though I like to say I don't care about Academy Awards. I will say it was nominated for 11 Oscars, including Best Picture. Jared, you have not seen Hugo yet.
I have not. It's actually, I thought about watching it this past week. I just didn't get around to it. But I'm glad that I held off until this week, because this will be an interesting dynamic for, like, a first for us, in the sense of this being a movie I haven't seen yet. I am not entirely sure what I'll think of it. I have a suspicion that I'll like it, just based on, one, what I've heard about it and the kind of movie it is, and two, because I know that you love it, and John and Jared tend to have similar tastes in movies. So
now you will have to tell me if you absolutely hate it, because in that case, we may have to have a conversation about whether we want to continue.
I can make a promise on that front, that any movie that on this channel that one of us, like, actively is like, I really don't like this movie and I don't want to talk about it, we're not going to make each other do that. That's not consistent with the vibe that we want to have with this channel. We might have varying degrees of infection for a movie. We might, have different tastes or opinions on it, but I'm not going to sit here and turn this into John versus Jared on Martin Scorsese's Hugo. That's not going to happen. I have a suspicion I'm going to like the movie, but I also want to be open to just the more authentic, approach to it, of like, this is a movie that I'm going to be experiencing for the first time. So I'm looking forward to that.
And it delights me that we'll be able to talk about this, because in past attempts I've made to sort of put this on a list of movies to discuss and see if anybody was interested. Just not many people in our circle have seen the film. So, and that kind of breaks my heart, because it's so wonderful, but yeah, so I'm glad we'll finally be able to do it. And I strongly encourage anybody who watches this, please, check out the film, so you can, be part of the discussion with us. It's very different from, Scorsese's other films, although I think it kind of has this, like, I feel like there's two different Marty Scorsese's. There's, gangster Marty, and then there's like cinema Marty, who's on display also in The Aviator, and a bit of that flavor is in this, even though I think this is a more emotional film, and it's made, not just for children, but certainly with children in mind. It wouldn't be me if I wasn't trying to, get you guys to buy some physical media. Recently, Arrow Video did a wonderful special edition of the film on Blu-ray and 4K. So please do check it out. This also actually includes the 3D version, which I can no longer play because I don't have a TV that has 3D anymore. I used to. But that was actually another thing that I was going to mention, Jared. Even though I think, the film still works beautifully in 2D, I would say keep in mind that this was one of the films that, like, it came out not too long after Avatar. I think it was about 2 years.
Yep. And
this was deemed like sort of the high point of what a filmmaker could do with 3D. And shocker, of course, that Scorsese, he pretty much masters anything he attempts. And it was such a breathtaking use of the format to actually, like, to help tell the story. There are, like, ways that the camera moves and certain angles that I remember seeing this in 3D in the theaters and just like, oh my God, like, for a guy who was not, super well versed in the format before he started shooting the movie, he figured it out really quick. And so I think even in 2D, you can kind of see what he was going for. And it's still a beautiful film in any format. But yeah, that is something to keep in mind, that was the original format of the movie. And and yeah, but it's, you know, for me, it's my absolute favorite of his filmography. I recognize I'm probably in a minority there, but I've always been the type of person who likes cinema that has an open heart, you know, more than a lot of his other films are very sort of dark and about, you know, the sort of, you know, the darker nature of, you know, of what humans are capable of. And this is different from that. This is a more hopeful movie from this director. And so much to the point that I remember they were like, Billy Crystal was making jokes about it at the Oscars. It's like, Marty, we didn't know you had it in you. So it'll be a lot of fun to talk about this one.
No, I'm looking forward to it. Especially, it'll be an interesting angle to come at it from, because I am. You mentioned that this is a different kind of genre for Marty, and I am more familiar with, one, his gangster movies, and two, his movies about deep religious guilt. That's another fun subgenre of his filmography that he likes to visit on occasion, and usually results in an impeccably crafted movie that also kind of crushes your soul, but lifts you up at the end, you know, as the faith.
Yeah, I do want to really quick, because I know that people have not as many people have seen this, so I do want to do my due diligence in selling it a little bit before we get back into our, you know, main discussion. So I'm just reading. Okay, Hugo is a 2011 American adventure drama film directed and produced by Martin Scorsese and adapted for the screen by John Logan. Based on Brian Selznick's 2007 book, The Invention of Hugo Cabret, it tells the story of a boy who lives alone in and I can't even begin to pronounce this, something French railway station in Paris in the 1930s, only to become embroiled in a mystery surrounding his late father's automaton, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's like, you know, a machine that's in the appearance of a, you know, person that can like do automated things like write and all that. So in a mystery surrounding his late father's automaton and the pioneering filmmaker George Méliès, which that last part sees, you can see where, you know, Marty's interest in this came into play, because it is very much about the early days of, you know, of cinema, and it's absolutely beautiful film. So I do please encourage you guys to give it a shot and watch it. You know, you don't quite have to go out and buy the, you know, special edition Blu-ray, but please do rent it. And so I just looking forward to that next week, and we do have a schedule carved out for the future.
We've kind of got a rolling. We talked about big plans, and we haven't finalized all of them yet, because sometimes big plans need a little while to fall into place. But I do, if you want to announce it, John, I think we have, at least after Hugo, the next 2 or 3 weeks lined up, and we won't be alone on that front.
Let me make sure that I get these right before I freak out our guests by announcing the wrong weeks. So next week we'll be discussing Hugo. Then the Sunday after that, on February 4th, was supposed to actually do this a long while ago, but Aaron and I got distracted. Our good friend Aaron M is going to be coming on, and we're finally going to be doing a discussion about The Mask of Zorro, which one of my all-time favorite movies. I think it's one of the best like summer popcorn movies ever made. So very excited to have her on to talk about that. And then the week after that, we'll actually be taking the week off because it's going to be the Super Bowl that Sunday, and I have a feeling that people won't be tuning in to watch the stream. And also, it gives us an extra week for what follows the week after that, which is good because we're going to be watching a season of television, and that television show is going to be The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. And which we're going to have Aaron coming back on, and we are also going to be having Cecilia, aka Deetsterelia, coming on to chat with us about that. So that is what we have laid out for the next couple weeks or so. And I'm very excited about both of those things, both Master of Zorro and Rings of Power. And we've actually been talking about Rings of Power for a while now.
Yeah, no, I'm so excited for both of those. Mask of Zorro specific. I mentioned. I think it was back in. I think it was like May or something of last year. We had our discussion on the Batman, and you were alluding to the fact that you were going to be talking about Mask of Zorro coming up, and I was like, I'm excited for that one. I mean, I wasn't going to be on the discussion at that time, but I'm like, I'm looking forward to tuning in because I do love that movie. And now I'm going to get to talk about it as well, along with Aaron, which will be fantastic.
Which let me interject. By the way, Cassie, you are more than welcome to come on and join us for that. I know it's probably not your first inclination to be on camera, but if you want to, all you have to do is say so, and we'll have you on.
Yeah, no, I absolutely, yeah. But the more the merrier. We just wanna celebrate. Looking forward to it, Aaron. We want to be able to celebrate this show because both John and I really did truly love it. Last I guess it was back in 2022 now. Wow. Rings of Power came out at the same time as House of the Dragon and Andor, and it was kind of like my personal fantasy nirvana to have those three shows on at the same time. But Rings of Power in particular is a show that I have a lot I want to talk about it because I was so impressed. I know not everyone was. I know that there are elements about that were tough for some people that we'll discuss, but I just think as a season of as a proof of concept for a larger show that will be going on for several years, I thought it was one of the best proof of concept first seasons I've ever seen, frankly. And I think that it'll be thrilling to be able to talk about it and talk about it with friends. So that when we alluded to trips to place, stories we love like Middle Earth and Star Wars, and Jane Austen and things like that, and all those will still be coming up. But Rings of Power was specifically one that John and I identified as we would love to have an opportunity to talk about this, and now we will.
Yeah, I do want to say, on a personal level, and I know I mentioned this before, if not here, probably over on Here Be Dragons, but the end of the year 2022 was tough for me. While the show was still on, I lost my mom, and I still enjoyed House of the Dragon, but it was not the show that I needed at that time. I still finished watching it, and I thought it was great, and I'm gonna probably get even more out of it when I rewatch it in a couple months, prepping for season 2. But I needed Lord of the Rings while I was going through that, and Rings of Power was just so beautiful and reaffirming, and it gave me hope in that time. And so, to anybody who just wants to, I'm fine with anybody who genuinely had issues with the show, didn't like it. But if you're just going to be snippy about it, or, if you're one of those awful people who's going to talk about, the issues of, race and all that, I'm just going to say it, and we're not monetized. So I'll say right now, fuck you, because this show rescued me in a lot of ways. So I cannot wait to just talk about how much I loved it, how much it meant to me during that time, and how much I think I agree with you. It was a phenomenal first season. So yeah. So it's going to be a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to that. And maybe it'll be our testing ground for, talking about something controversial, so that when we get around to our Game of Thrones discussions, someday, we'll be prepped, if we have any, disturbances in the chat. But
well, I am ready. I'm ready to be a happy warrior for these shows that I love dearly, even if they're not universally beloved.
Yeah. Okay, so wow, that was one heck of a mid-roll. Oh, really quick, I do want to say I want to thank everybody who has joined in the chat tonight. It really means a lot, and also I know that we have a few new subscribers since the last week, because hey, our Indiana Jones discussion actually did really, really well. So if you're one of those new subscribers and you're watching right now, thank you very much, and we hope you're enjoying this discussion and discussions to come. If you're watching this for the first time and you haven't subscribed, please do so. We'd love to have you back. But yeah, okay. So anything you want to say before we dive back into the procedure?
No, just to echo all that, we don't have these discussions because we're in it for the money, or because we want to get YouTube famous or anything like that. We're talking about these movies and shows because it's enjoyable for us. It's part of it, an opportunity for us to engage with stories we love and people who also, help form a community around those stories. So we are not necessarily looking to try and, hack the algorithm so that we can, get thousands of views on all these things. But anyone who does end up finding us and likes kind of the type of discussions that we're offering, welcome. We're glad to have you. And as long as, you are here in the kind of a respectful spirit of talking about movies from the perspective of someone who wants to have a fair-minded discussion, even if you don't agree with our position on it, you're more than welcome. We're not going to engage with anyone who, is here to try and stir up hate or division on purpose, but anyone who has a different opinion or a different take, or just wants to kind of help, share in the enjoyment of discussing about movies, we're happy to have you. And leave a comment in the chat.
Yeah. And for anybody who came here tonight exclusively for the Prestige discussion, we apologize because that was a nearly 20-minute mid-roll. Very sorry about that. But you know what? We had some things to talk about. So let's dive back in and let's.
Okay, well, let's just say it at the top. Borden is a twin, and Robert Angier had Tesla create a machine that clones himself.
And that doesn't sound weird at all. But hopefully, if you're this far, you already knew that. Yeah, so the big thing is the reason why Borden feels like a splintered character is because he's two characters. And I will be honest, the first time I saw this movie, I was like, this guy is an asshole. Until, of course, the end of the movie. And I will say, like you mentioned about how the things are repeated from the first scene of the movie to then the last scene where Cutler, repeats, the words about, each magic trick has 3 parts. But when he says, but making something disappear isn't enough, you have to bring it back. At the end of the movie, then when Borden enters the room and hold out his hands to his daughter. Like, okay, I know the character's done a lot of shitty stuff throughout the movie, but man, I get emotional every time.
Yeah.
It's so great. So the big, needless to say, the big reveal of that moment is the fact that, Borden has actually been two people, him and his twin brother, who have been basically playing the same, person for years on end in order to do their magic. And so the Borden who is locked up is actually the brother. And so his last magic trick is, in fact, that, that Borden, we'll call him the original, but it's hard to say which one.
Well, yeah, there is a way to kind of delineate it for an easier purposes of our discussion, because I'll bring in an element from the novel here. We are introduced to the character of Alfred Borden, and then he has his ostensible assistant, Bernard Fallon, who's really the other Borden twin in disguise, and they exchange that identity throughout the movie. But for our purposes, in the book, they actually make it clear that Alfred Borden is a composite identity, and the name is actually a portmanteau. One of the twins is named Albert, and that's the one who falls in love with Sarah and has the daughter Jess and survives at the end. And then the other one is Frederick, who is the one who falls in love with Olivia and is a little bit more like ruthless and obsessive, and is the one who ultimately dies. And their names, Albert, Frederick, put them together, Alfred. And we get little hints of that throughout the movie. Specifically, I know that there's a scene where Olivia, who is the one that Frederick, the twin, is in love with,
I think
she calls him Freddie. Yeah.
Okay, it's one of my favorite line deliveries in the movie, even though Freddie is being very cruel in this scene, but it's kind of understandable why he's, in the mood that he's in. He's just recovered from being buried alive. But I just love it when Olivia leaves the table, and then Sarah says, Freddie, and then he goes, well, that's my name. He's so drunk and he's so annoyed, pissed off because, gotta be honest, the man kind of deserves to get drunk after what he's been through on
his behavior in that scene is kind of boorish and not sympathetic, but it's moderately understandable for him perspective, in the sense of, I was just captured by our mortal enemy and buried alive, and so I didn't know if I was going to make out of it, but now I'm the public presenting Borden twin, so I'm going to get drunk and I'm going to bring the woman I love to dinner with our wife, and you're not going to say anything about it. And you're just like, come on, man, you could be a little bit more,
and to be clear, what these two brothers are doing to, first of all, to Sarah and Borden's child, and then later to Olivia as well, it's cruel and it's selfish, and it's like every conceivable adjective you can throw at it. But there are certain moments where you're like, as in this, it's like his attitude in that moment is perfectly understandable, because he's been through a lot. But so it's very difficult to understand, they're doing this all for the sake of their magic, because that's how they do it. They live their life as an illusion where they're both this, composite character. And so they've made that decision to the point where, and they don't talk about it to anyone. They don't share it with those they love. Don't even reveal it in a, it's the act continues in the private journal, to the extent that, he even writes in there, I can never be sure which knot I tied. Pardon me swearing, that, I tied the line for double and the other half of me swearing that I didn't. That's all, part of the act, because he knows that Angier is reading the diary. And so the only other person who knows anything about this is each respective brother. And so it's not a very, we understand why he does it, but it's not a very sympathetic, thing that they do. But having accepted that, then once you realize that that's what's been going on, then it just opens up all these new layers for these two different characters. And that's why, especially as it relates to those two and Christian Bale's performance as each brother, so rewarding when you go back to watch it. And it's so fun just watching how as as Borden, number one, he's a much quieter person.
Yeah.
And even, he seems like a much more mellow, courteous kind of guy. And brother number two, as represented by Fallon, and he's very he's the one who gets set off very easily. And once you realize that these are two different men, it's very fascinating to watch, to watch both performances. And we haven't even gotten into what Hugh Jackman does with the actor double. We'll get to that, but
the theme of duality, it's not just confined to one character. Angier has his own other basket of neuroses that we can unpack, and in particular, I believe Cassie mentioned the chat question. This was a book. It was a book. To be clear, neither of us, or I don't know if you have, John, I haven't read the book. I did know that because it was based on a book and there were a couple of questions that I wanted to understand about adaptive choices. So I did kind of do some research into it. And there are a couple of things that are, particularly with Angier, that I do want to touch on in relation to the book. But suffice it to say that, the idea of duality and the fact that Borden being a twin, that all comes from the book, and this idea of the shared identity. And in particular, like you mentioned, that the brothers are different men, even though they are living the same life by choice and are utterly committed to this illusion to the point that they tell no one else, because as Borden himself says, you can never tell anyone your secret. They'll beg and flather you for it, but as soon as you give it up, you'll be nothing. And also he says the secret impresses no one. The trick you use it for is everything. It kind of makes sense when you consider his working class upbringing. Unlike Angier and Lord Caldlow, he did not have, he probably came up pretty rough, and this was the way that he and his brother, they decided to kind of make their name, make their mark in the world. But as you alluded to, I'll call the surviving brother Albert, the one who falls in love with Sarah and has the daughter with her, Jess. As you mentioned, he really is the one who seems a little bit more measured, a little bit more quieter, soft-spoken, a little bit more, capable of love in the traditional sense, shall we say, a little bit more selfish. And the one for whom the obsession, even though he clearly has it because he's committed to this idea, the one for whom the obsession isn't quite as strong, because there's that wonderful moment late in the movie after Angier has debuted his new version of the transported man trick, and it becomes clear that it's a much bigger success than Borden's original version, and they're coming to terms with that, and the surviving brother Albert says that, you know, we're done, you know, and he like we can't top this. It's, you know, it's time. It's okay. We can stop. We can I don't need to know his secret. And you can understand that because this comes right on the heels of the fact that their duality has driven their wife, the woman that Albert loved and had the child with, to the point of suicide because she couldn't handle it. And so Albert ultimately is feeling a little bit more self-reflective, whereas, you know, Frederick, the kind of the colder brother, he doesn't really, you know, he's a little bit more driven by the obsession still. He was not the one who was in love with Sarah. And so he's the one who can't stop. And that's why, you know, you see Borden in the scene where he's saying, we don't need to know his secret, you know, we're done. And then in the very next scene, you see him in the audience and he's trying to get behind the stage. It's because that brother is...
But it works so well even when you don't know, because you're thinking, again, the whole movie feels like this is a man so at odds with himself. And so it's that classic thing where, you know, classic editing device where it's like you say a character talking, basically, you know, talking themselves into a particular course of action, then cut to the next scene and they've done the opposite. So like, so you don't doubt it. It's, you know, it plays, you know, very well. But then once you know everything and go back, it's, you know, it's just like a whole nother dimension. I have to ask you, like, did you catch on to?
Not on the first watch. No. I mean, the thing is, one of the kind of the ways that the movie plays fair with you, even though it's kind of doing a sleight of hand, is, as Cassie alludes to in the chat, it is Christian Bale playing both Borden and Fallon, the assistant who's under the kind of the beard and the glasses and the top hat. But it's very good makeup because, you know, it's enough to fool you at a close glance. As Olivia says, if you look close enough, you can tell. Like, if you look, once you know what you are looking for, if you look at the one scene where they actually do fixate on Fallon's face when the two brothers are saying goodbye, you can tell that it's Christian Bale or under a bunch of very good makeup. But the first time I watched it, I wasn't looking for that. I had no idea I was supposed to be looking for that. And so it didn't register. And then that's what, and the reveal preserved its efficacy. And even after now that I know this, for instance, that like until that pivotal emotional moment, they never actually give you a very close look at Fallon. He's kind of hiding in the background. He's kind of turning his face a little bit away from the camera. He's, you know, and he never speaks. They mentioned that in the movie. You know, he, like, when Angier and Cutter capture him, they're like, we thought we could beat the secret out of your assistant, but it turns out he doesn't talk at all. And you're like, oh.
I will say, like, I remember having, like, this feeling up in the back of my neck, like, something's off about that guy. Mm-hmm. But I never suspected that that's what it was. Yeah. It was just, he was just very weird. Would not dissimilar to how Olivia feels about there's something about that man that I just don't
something that you don't like. And he's like, if you trust me, trust Fallon. And I do want to bring up Cassie's comment when she asked, so now that we're here, I'll ask again, do you think Sarah knew? It's a great question, and it's one that the movie doesn't give us a definitive answer to, but one behind the scenes anecdote that I actually found fascinating and kind of delving into that kind of production stuff was, there's a moment in that scene where Sarah's kind of breaking and she's challenging one of the twins who in that scene is Fallon, because he's the one who says, not today, I don't love you. But when Sarah is her mind is kind of fraying from the way that this man is treating her and the duality of him, she has a line where she specifically says, I know what you are. Not who, I know what you are. And in that and I was like, that seems to me an indication that she has an idea of something going on. But one thing that's interesting and kind of introduces an element of ambiguity is apparently Rebecca Hall, the wonderful Rebecca Hall, who we're going to have to pay due diligence to, she improvised that line. And Christopher Nolan, who is not famous for allowing a lot of improvisation in his scripts, loved it so much he kept it in the movie. So that's an instance where I do think that it might be a case of Rebecca Hall kind of taking a little bit more ownership of her character and being like, this woman knows more than the movie is telling us explicitly that she knows. But to answer Cassie's question, I do think she may not know the full extent, but I think she has an idea, because as Cutter knows too, Cutter at the beginning is like, he's got to be using a double, it's the only way. I don't think they both realize just how thoroughly these two have decided to live the same life, but I think she can definitely tell when one twin is telling her that she loves her and they love her and mean it, and when they don't. But I think by the end, she does know. And it is notable that, when she goes to Fallon's or Borden's workshop to commit suicide and hang herself, I think that in many ways is part of her like making a final statement that you have devoted your life to this art obsessively, even more than me, and I finally understand why, and this is the cost. I am the cost.
I think that's a perfectly valid interpretation. I'm not quite sure where I land on it. My first inclination is that she doesn't know. And I think I know what you are is more of a sort of, and the fact that she says, and I'll tell her, what you are. It feels to me more like the way she views him as sort of this monster who, will be two completely different people, and and be able to mean it at different times, both when he says, I love you, and then when he doesn't actually mean it. And I think that last scene before she commits suicide, I think is played in a way that it's very ambiguous as to whether she knows or not. My first instinct was that I felt like she doesn't know, but I also feel like it's purposely ambiguous. Mm-hmm. And so it's probably one of those things that I'll end up flopping back and forth on. But I kind of like that we're not given a definitive answer on that.
Yeah, and I think that that's the right creative choice for the movie. I think I kind of come down on the sense that she knows, or she has a strong suspicion, just because that kind of, to me, feels a little bit more satisfying for Sarah's arc as a character, because, it is ultimately a tragedy that this woman who fell in love with this man who, charmed her in a theater with the bird trick, and thought that she was going to be having this happy, fulfilling life with him. But as Borden mentions at the end, he and his brother were each living half of a full life, and that was enough for them, but it was not enough for the women that they loved. And Olivia, Scarlett Johansson's character, the one that Frederick was in love with, she gets a much more definitive moment of saying, basically, fuck this, when even if she doesn't put it together quite, she's like, this is insanity. The fact that you just, you lost your wife and you don't seem to be that upset about it. And you could be having this conversation with another woman in a different restaurant right now about me. Enough of this. You two, meaning you and Angier, deserve each other, but also you and your brother, implicitly, again, even though I don't think Olivia knows the full truth, deserve each other. And she gets to kind of wash her hands of the whole thing, and it's a great moment for her character. Sarah, unfortunately, chooses to take another way out because, she's frankly suffering more as the woman who thought that she had made a commitment to this man and who is not making the full commitment back to her. And the choice that she chooses to make to take her own life rather than, leave with her daughter, it's a difficult choice for us to comprehend because it seems so devastating and heartbreaking, particularly the more modern sensibilities. But in her case, it was the choice that she made. And if within that choice, I think I kind of want to give her as much credit as I possibly can, that she was not just being tortured by a horrifying question that she can never answer, but the idea that she figured it out and she is washing her hands of it it's her own way. But as you say, the movie doesn't confirm that one way or another. It's one of the kind of the elegant beauties of it that it kind of leaves us wondering as well.
Really quick, I do just want to say thank you, AR, for stopping in, and also bye, Cassie. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight. I will say, this may be where my inclination towards seeing characters meet unceremonious and horrifying ends is coloring my perspective. I think it would be nice if she has a more assertive, ending. It would make me feel better for the character, but also that very often is not the case. And ultimately it's, if she doesn't know, it's all the more tragic, which is from a character point of view, it's not what we want to see for her, but also sometimes I do wonder if I do start to hope that it's the sort of more optimistic, path, view on a character. It's yes, but the reality tugging at me is saying, no, they're not getting that. But I will say that my personal opinion of if she knows, I think she discovers it in that I think it occurs to her in that last moment when she enters the room and before she decides to hang herself. And so, but like I said, there's lots of ambiguity for that, not just for whether she knows, but when she knows it. And I think that's what's beautiful. Well, not beautiful, but you know what I mean? I think that's what works so well about it, is that we're not given a definitive answer there. But on a more optimistic note, Sarah is played by Rebecca Hall, who is phenomenal in this. I love, I always know she's headed for a tragic end, but whenever I watch this movie and she first, pops up, in the movie, I can't help but smile because she has such a wonderfully sweet, uplifting personality. I love the laugh that she does when the brothers are sort of testing their method, so to speak, and and Alfred is walking, her up to the door, and he's like, jokingly says, "You think that's enough to keep me out?" And then she goes in and then turns around, and the other brother is in there with a pot of coffee, and she just bursts out laughing because, of course, she thinks it's a magic trick. Which it's simultaneously funny, but also it's the first step along to the tragedy of that relationship, that even from that moment there's deception there, but especially in our first viewing, we don't know that at first, and so it is initially funny for the audience as well. And yeah, just she just has a wonderful, it's the way she plays the character, I think is just so.
Yeah.
Really
Yes, it's a great performance for a very challenging character, and I tend to think Rebecca Hall is always a welcome presence in the movie, because she has this very raw emotion that's kind of just always simmering under the surface, and she does have a tendency to play characters that seem to be afflicted a bit more by tragedy, but there are ways to play that are more like outward, and she has a way to kind of capture that inner torment and go kind of like bleed out a little bit, that really makes her like so incredibly sympathetic, probably the most sympathetic character in this movie. And as Guilty Undertaker points out, I didn't realize this until I checked her IMDb page. This is only her second movie ever, which is crazy because she is so good in it.
This may be one of those instances of where that probably wouldn't surprise me if I think about it being 2006, but I've seen this movie so many times over the years that as I've become more familiar with her, and as she's been in other stuff, I think I've just come to kind of accept it of, oh yeah, that's Rebecca Hall. But back in the day, she was probably came off as like a completely fresh new face, in movies. And again, I'm going back to the fact that this movie is 18 years old now, and I can't believe it. But no, and yeah, it's like she had this ability to, it's those like wonderfully sweet moments, like the way she, interacts with, her nephew earlier in the movie. And I love that interaction right there. Where Borden's like, no, see, the bird's okay. And he's like, and the kid's like, but where's his brother?
From the mouths of babes. Yeah.
Yes, and like it's right there. But yeah, and then there's just little moments like when he's talking about the bullet catch, and and of course that's actually Freddie. And at that moment, because then he says a very unconvincing "I love you," and that's when we get that moment from her of oh, you don't mean it today, and she's like, some days you mean it, and some days you love something else like magic, more than me. And at that point she says to herself that she likes being able to tell the difference, because it makes the times when he does mean it, or when it's coming from when it's actually coming from Borden, makes that all the more special. But then as the movie comes on, then the other side of that is when she says it makes it all the harder to hear when he actually means it. And to have those scenes, bookending each other, it's just, she plays it so wonderfully, and it's so tragic and sad. And
yeah, no, it's that particular motif of the "Do you love me? I do love you. You mean it today. You don't mean it today." It starts. It's always sad, but it starts off as kind of like sweet and sad, and then it just becomes like crushingly sad, and you can see how that kind of like ultimate uncertainty of that idea ultimately is what causes her to lose her grip on reality to the point that she decides she can't handle it and needs to take her own life. But and it's a subtle way of kind of seeding that slowly, the whole idea that, you know, she, like, you can be as committed to the illusion as the two Borden brothers are, as Angier, or as obsessively driven as Angier proves to be. But ultimately, if someone is looking closely enough, as we see from the beginning, as you can tell, because there are seams, there are hints, there are like small moments, and there are things that you truly cannot fake. And one of them, you know, might sound corny to say it, but it is true in this case. One of the things that they ultimately cannot fake is the fact that one Borden brother is in love, just genuinely in love with Sarah, and the other one is not. And for someone who's as emotionally attuned as Sarah proves to be, she might not know the details, but she knows that.
Yeah. And speaking of, you know, Frederick, who does not love Sarah, and he falls in love with Olivia. Let's talk about the amazing Scarlett Johansson, who, like, I think I kind of undervalued her role in this movie back in the day, partly because, again, on first viewing, you think Borden is one person, and so I don't think that her role as sort of, you know, the magician's assistant, but also mistress, it you know, comes off as well defined. But I think then once you do know that actually Freddie is his own person, and he has his own love story, you know, with Olivia. I think that becomes its own kind of tragedy in a way. The fact that he has to go through his entire life denying, you know, or having to play a role where he can't be with the woman he loves in the way that he wants to. And the fact that poor Olivia has, you know, has to contend with, you know, two neurotic men who, like, neither one of them really deserves her. You know,
And I would say three neurotic men, because of course she starts off, you know, working with Angier and actually being.
Oh yeah, that's what I meant though.
Oh yeah, like, I mean, but yeah, what's great about Scarlett Johansson's Olivia is she is much more of like a kind of live wire spark in the movie that can be very kind of cold at times. She comes into the movie, she just has a kind of a smile and a charm and an energy to her, you know, and she knows like a lot. You know, she is not the kind of woman who is kind of big, you know, under any illusions, shall we say, about what's going on here in terms of the stagecraft and the and also the personal role she plays. Like, she knowingly gets involved with these tricks and the subterfuge, and she also, when she ultimately gets involved with Borden, she knows she's involved with a married man, ostensibly. She even says that when he comes to see her, and it's in that case Albert, who is in love with Sarah and upset about the fight. But when he brings up Sarah, she's like, "Don't mention your wife's name when you're with me. You don't have to talk about that stuff." which is a very progressive, even though it's, might be, depending on your moral code, not the right way to look at it, but she knows what she's doing. For a woman in the 1890s, she is not like under any delusions about what her lot in life is. She's very much trying to make her own way, but there's a bridge too far even for her, because while she may have some tolerance for these games that these men are playing, she has lines that she will not cross. And in this case, they're more like lines related to her relationship with these two men and how far they're willing to effectively use her. Because when Angier, who she's sincerely involved with at that time, tells her, I need you to go work for Borden, and try to discover his trick, she's genuinely offended by that, both because he's sending her away and also because he's making it clear that he values what he can get from her in this relationship more than he values her. And when he tells her, when you go to Borden, tell him the truth so that you can, like, that I sent you, so that you can gain his trust. And she goes and she tells him the truth. And then she tells him the real truth, her truth, which is that Angier tossed me aside for this, game he's playing. And he thinks I'm still working with him, but I am ready to be done with him. And then their relationship develops from there, the relationship with Frederick, that becomes a sincere romantic relationship. But even then, she kind of knows that there are lines. She brings the diary back to Angier. She tells him that she's in love with Borden. And he's like, then I know how hard this must have been for you. And it was hard for her. But she's still willing to play the kind of the trick on Angier of sending him to America off on what appears to be a wild goose chase. But there is still a line that she will not cross. And when it becomes clear that the games that these men are playing are actually having deadly consequences, she very wisely decides, enough of this. And she leaves. And that's the last time we see her in the movie. And it's a great moment for her character.
I think that, she does the best job out of any character in the movie of like getting out when she needs to, and hopefully she ends up having a much better future than than anybody else. But yeah, no, and again, it's fascinating to go back to when this came out, 2006. This was just 3 years after Lost in Translation, like a completely different era of Scarlett Johansson, the actress. Because now everything feels so rooted in her as Black Widow, in Marvel, and everything else. Like her career is kind of looked at from that frame, and just it's just. I know you told me not to talk too much about the passage of time, but I can't help it.
No, it's appropriate in this case because, as we're talking about Scarlett Johansson's like evolution as an actor, like this is not, when people think Scarlett Johansson, who has been in a lot of incredible movies and big franchises, like this is not a role that springs to mind, but it's a great performance of hers. And it's one that like is a worthy milestone, because when this came out in 2006, I didn't, know Scarlett Johansson into the MCU hadn't started yet. It's a time capsule in that way. I knew Scarlett Johansson from two absolute cinematic classics. One being Home Alone 3, aka not the one with Macaulay Culkin, and Michael Bay's cinematic masterpiece, The Island, starring Hugh and McGregor, who's also playing clones in that.
Can I just be honest? And okay, Lord knows I love Ewan McGregor, but the reason I went to go see The Island was Scarlett Johansson.
Oh yes, no,
let's just be honest. And because I'm not condoning this, but let's be honest, Michael Bay always makes the women in his movies look really, really, really great. Uh, not that she needs much help, but
Yeah.
but you kind of know what you're getting when you go to a Michael Bay movie, and I was still, much younger than I am now, and so I'm not going to apologize for being driven by my hormones in that case.
No. I mean, Scarlett Johansson is a very beautiful woman, and when at the time this movie came out, let's just say that she was very. I was very susceptible to her many charms.
But it also showed, again, talking about the evolution of her career and the box that she would, no pun intended, because of course with this movie, there's an actual box.
Yes.
but the box that she was put into as an actress back then was very much this is a very attractive young woman. Let's really capitalize on that, which is, why, let's just say it, a movie like this is kind of suited to it, where the outfits she's wearing is very much, showcasing like how beautiful she is. But as the years have progressed, even when she first showed up in Iron Man 2, it was all about that, about, there's this extraordinarily beautiful actress looking really great in a skin tight, outfit. But then things changed over the years where it wasn't just about that for her. I think she was really able to, get out of that to where she got to really, even in the case of Black Widow, really examine that character and do a lot of good things with her performance in those films. And then if you look at the work she's doing today, stuff like, what was that movie she did with Adam Driver?
Marriage Story. And Jojo Rabbit, and a lot of other films where she's gotten to showcase like what an extraordinary actress she is. And so, yeah, it just goes to show, the evolution of her career over the years has been extraordinary. Yeah, and she brings a lot to this role. I think we had alluded to on the Oppenheimer stream. Sometimes a criticism that gets leveled at Christopher Nolan movies is some people feel that sometimes his female characters are not as well drawn as some of his male characters. I don't always feel that way, but in this case, I can see how a role like Olivia could have been so much more superficial if they didn't give her those moments that ultimately allow her to assert herself so directly. And also if an actor who wasn't quite as talented as Scarlett Johansson was playing her, it would have been easier for her to just be kind of more off to the side. She doesn't allow that to happen. She kind of seizes the screen whenever she's on. She gets the chance and ultimately gets the big satisfying walk-out moment that allows her to be one of the few characters in this movie who really gets to emerge from it with her integrity more or less intact.
Yeah, because I'll even say it. I think that, this isn't the most, the most well-drawn of her characters. I think there actually could have been much more to Olivia, in this film. But again, as you say, I think, her Scarlett Johansson's screen presence and her skills as an actress really, did a lot for the role. And I don't know. It's one of those things where you're like, especially this is this film actually has quite the ensemble. But it's primarily about these two men at the center, of this conflict. So it's like, you can't really veer too much, like, away from the focal point of this. So anything she gets is going to be primarily in scenes, with Angier or with Borden, and so, yeah. I think she's had much more dynamic characters as as time has gone on, but at the same time, I think she does a phenomenal job with the character as written and brings a lot of life to it. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to talk about because we talked about Borden at length and all his emotional entanglements? Do you want to talk now about Angier and specifically the kind of the nature of his duality?
Yeah, we'll talk about Angier, and we'll also talk a bit about Cutler as well. Yeah, because we haven't Cutter. We haven't delved into the genius that is Michael Caine. Who and he has been sort of for many years he had been the secret sauce of Christopher Nolan's movies. But yeah, no, I don't know where it Angier is again, he's so fascinating, even as he goes down into the darkest, reaches of humanity. I will say I'd like to start off on a bit of a lighter note. I alluded to it earlier. I love his performance as the actor, Gerald Root, his name is. He does such a great job at making you believe that this is actually a different guy. It's just something he does with his teeth and the shape of his mouth, and it's just. And I think, I'm not sure, but I think he might have a prosthetic on his nose to make it a little bit bigger. I'm not sure.
They do some makeup around his ears and his nose and everything to give you them enough physical difference that you can establish that they're different people. And Borden, as he says, he can tell the difference, not just because the guy acts differently and talks differently, but the way that they carry themselves and the way they look. It's not a perfect imitation, and that kind of plays into the nature of Angier's obsession, because when he gets fascinated by Borden's trick, the greatest magic trick he's ever seen, and Cutter's immediately like, well, it's got to be a double. That's the only way we could do it. And he's like, no, that's too simple. It's too easy. Well, yes and no. But when they decide they're going to steal it, as Angier's like, this man stole my life, I'm going to steal his trick, they go out and they get a double, and the double is not good enough in so many ways. Angier has that line where he says, I don't need him to be my brother, I need him to be me.
Well, yeah, first Cutter says, give me a week and, he'll be like your brother. And then he says, I don't need him to be my brother, I need him to be me. Give me a month.
Yeah, give me which, as I think someone alluded to earlier in the chat, this movie doesn't have a lot of laugh out loud funny moments. It's a pretty bleak moment, but there are a couple small grace notes like that one that give you a little bit of a chuckle, if not an outright.
Oh, and everything that practically everything that Root does, is just. Again, Hugh Jackman just plays him so hilariously that, he just opens his mouth and you're like, oh my God, this is not Wolverine.
Yeah. And honestly, this type of performance seemed to be a bit more what Hugh Jackman, and his inner theater kid seemed to like. I think it seems like Hugh Jackman is much more, Greatest Showman than he is Logan, adamantium skeleton infused badass in real life. But of course, that's his most famous role, and he, he bulks himself up every performance, and he is phenomenal as Wolverine. But this is a different type of character, and he kind of plays into that in the sense of his nature as a superhero kind of cushions you against the possibility of just how dark this particular character is gonna get, because Wolverine isn't gonna be the bad guy. He will be
and especially at this point in his career, again, only 2006.
Yeah.
This was the same year that X3 was coming out. So like he was still in, the height of like, being Wolverine and in X-Men. And so you absolutely just thought of him as, well, he's going to be the hero of this movie.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, it's like another setup for the audience to, to kind of make them, because, okay, Christian Bale had just played Batman, but still he had done other dark stuff in his career up to that point and plus he just seems like, if you have to pick out the actor who played Wolverine or the actor who played Batman for who's going to be the more villainous of the two, I'm going with the actor who played Batman because that's an intrinsically like darker, character. But yeah, it was so amazing. And again, talking about Cutter, I think another thing that kind of disguises the fact of where Angier's dinner goes, because you have this lighthearted friendship between him and Cutter, which is just I love all their stuff. It's so much fun. One of my favorite parts is when he's putting the machinery on him for the new version of the trick with the bird. And, before it all goes horribly wrong, it's revealed that this can do the trick without harming the bird. And I love when, Angier says, I thought you said I was going to have to get my hands dirty. And he does. And maybe one day you will. I just needed to know that you could.
And how that comes to be foreshadowing that you didn't realize was foreshadowing at the time. But yeah, that's kind of part of the series of events that further helps endear us, or not endear us, but like establish us a bit more on Angier's side, because after the initial tragedy of losing his wife, he really kind of suffers kind of a series of losses, because he is, he decides he's going to become his own magician, and Cutter decides to side with him, not with Borden, and there's the moment where he decides he's going to take on his stage name, the Great Danton, which he initially scoffed at when his wife Julia suggested it, but after she dies, he kind of has that quiet little moment where Cutter's like, isn't that a bit too, old-fashioned? And he's like, no, it's sophisticated, which were her words, Yeah. And you're like, you're like, oh, he's doing this a bit more in her honor, in her memory. And then he has professional, travails. He does have the unsympathetic moment where he is possibly going to murder Borden with the bullet catch trick. But you also understand him in that moment because he's trying to get the answer from Borden. What knot did you tie? And of course, Borden.
Yeah, and he's still in a state of extreme grief at that moment. Yeah. So we understand it.
Yeah, but then of course, as Borden develops the trick, and you see him like trying to struggle to, like, he's becoming increasingly obsessed, and he has the moment where he tries to do the birdcage trick that Borden sabotages in turn, and then he loses the gig because of that, and then they discover the new trick and they have to rely on this double. And the moment that his performance, you don't realize it at the time, but the moment that his performance really turns is the first time that they do the trick, and you get that absolutely beautiful moment where it's successful, it's a rousing success, and Angier is under the stage, and he kind of stands up and he drinks in the adoration of the crowd that he cannot see, that as we later find out that's kind of what he lives for in many ways. And he kind of takes that bow, and at the moment it feels triumphant, but knowing the way the movie ultimately shakes out, you can see that's the moment where it truly becomes dark, because it's not enough for him. He needs to be the one who has the prestige. And so he decides the trick isn't good enough. I need to do more. I need to do more. And then, of course, even as we start to see his obsession is maybe going a little bit too far, there are still moments that inspire us to be sympathetic to him. Like Borden sabotages his trick and he falls and he gets crippled when Borden takes the mat out from under the stage. So it's yet another.
Which, by the way, is another like moment of. It's actually a bit of a moment of levity because it is so funny, Christian Bale's performance, and that's great because it also shows you that's after Olivia, starts working for him, and you can see that his showmanship is starting to come up because he's so fun in that where he's like, pardon my intrusion. And then he promotes his show across the street. And I love when he says, take it easy on the poor fellow. He does try so very hard.
Yep. And all while Root the double is hanging above the stage. So that's
which, by the way, I was doing those. I did not realize this until I was getting the pictures together. There's actually some pictures that are not in the film. One which I noticed first, this particular image of Scarlett Johansson, because I don't think this costume is actually seen in the film, and this looks like it's from the same scene. It's with her on stage with Borden, so it looks like we have a deleted scene of seeing Borden actually on stage in a packed house. And that would have been cool to see, but I as with all of Christopher Nolan's movies, he edits his films pretty tight, and so if he leaves something out, that he feels it just wasn't needed in the film. But still, it would have been nice to have a little deleted scene section to have a look at that, and maybe we will one day. Who knows? But
the showmanship definitely comes up a level for Christian Bale's Borden, and that's another element that really kind of just drives the idea that Angier's jealousy and growing obsession with besting him, because the showmanship was always his thing. Borden was always the better technical crafting magician, but he wasn't as successful. When he debuts the original Transported Man trick that so fascinates Angier, they know it doesn't get a big clap because the audience is they don't have time to react, and it's because, as Cutter says, he doesn't know how to sell it. He's a wonderful magician. He's a dreadful showman, which Angier is a great showman. He just doesn't have quite the same stuff.
One would say he's even the greatest showman.
Oh, yes.
Sorry, I had to. No, what's really interesting is the way Angier lies to himself, because actually what prompts Cutter to say that is, at first Angier says he's a terrible magician. To go from that to then acknowledging the truth that once, in his view, he's won, then he can say, you were the better magician. And poor Angier, he thinks he's won in that moment, and he has not.
Well, let's not go too much poor Angier, because that, of course, that is after the moment where he has taken his turn. We already kind of discussed him going to America, meeting Tesla, kind of their conversation that they have about obsession, where Tesla repeatedly warns him, no good is going to come of this obsession. And Angier has the line where it's if you truly understand obsession, then I won't change my mind. And Tesla comes through. Yeah, so be it. And Tesla gives him enough rope to hang himself, even though that's Borden's fate ultimately, is the fact that he does deliver the machine for him, the machine that they thought that Borden had gone to get, and it turns out he never did. But Tesla's machine works. As we alluded to earlier, he it actually does create a
And
fully
it's
realized duplicate.
and it's a Star Trek death trap. The teleportation, which is why you don't actually want to teleport.
No, it's the whole idea of which the movie doesn't fully engage with, but there are certain logical fallacies or thought experiments about the idea of teleportation, the teleportation paradox, and the whole ship of Theseus idea, which is basically when you are teleported and you're not like traveling through an alternate dimension like Nightcrawler, are you actually being disassembled and beamed and reassembled, or are you just killing yourself and an actual like duplicate of you is being spawned in the different space? And in this case, turns out it's the lab, which actually I did want to allude to it just because I'd mentioned the fact that this was based on a book. This is one of the elements of the book that the movie changed, and I actually think probably changed for the better in terms of its thematic parallels, because in the book, there is a machine that Tesla builds for Angier, and it does create a duplicate that has all of the original's memories. But in the book, when they go through that process, the original Angier effectively becomes a lifeless husk, and he's fully transported into the new individual, But and whether or not it's the same Angier or it's a different Angier, that's a question that's still left open. But regardless, in the book, it's a lifeless husk that he needs to dispose of, and he refers to those as the prestige materials, as he does in the movie. And the movie, of course, makes a very interesting thematic choice that no, actually, we're going to change that, and the duplicate and the original are both going to survive, and both are going to have the full memories. And so what happens? And the terrible and true answer is that, well, if we're going to keep doing this, one of them's got to die. And thus Angier's kind of dark, twisted thing that, like, fully, once we understand the scope of it, causes us to lose our sympathy for him. This is where it comes in. And there's so many layers to how he decides to go about this, and the psychology involved in it. It's one of the most fascinating layers to the entire movie that is just awash with them, and you would not have gotten it if he was just effectively beaming himself to the other place and leaving behind a lifeless shell. You really have to have the idea of what happens to the other, what happens to the man in the box that nobody cares about.
And yeah, because you just have to go all in and because from his point of view, he says I don't think he's even completely sure what actually happens. Because he's not sure if because from his point of view, every time he's done this, he ends up in the prestige, and he's fine, but but then he has to accept the fact that the him in the present tense, next time he does that, is going to be killed. Yeah. And it's just so screwed up. It's like, and you just watch his performance in that, that final scene before, it shows him getting locked in the tank, and just the performance of this guy who's willingly going towards his death, and he's committing suicide, all in the service of ruining his rival. And it's just it's a fascinating this is what part of what I was talking about with the fascinating psychology, because in Angier's mind, it's almost like a 50-50 coin flip
he talks at the end to Borden about, it took courage to step into that machine, not knowing if I would end up under the stage or if I would be the prestige that gets.
Which is such a delusion.
It is a delusion in so many ways, because because it may be a 50-50 chance that I get to be up on the stage and basking in the applause that I so crave, but there's a 100% chance that a fully conscious Angier is going to fall into that tank and drown, which is a situation because he set it up that way. And another fascinating layer to it is, of course, drowning in that box. As Cutter said, this box has special significance to these two men, is the way that his wife died. And it makes you wonder, based on the anecdote that Cutter told him, does he think that this is like a humane way to do this, of allowing his duplicate to fall into the water and drown, and it'll be like going home? But it's not, because Cutter lied to him, and it's actually agony. So
that line delivery, the way Cutter says, "I was lying," he said it was agony.
And you see the look on Hugh Jackman's face after that happens. You see the weight of it settle onto him, just the enormity of what he's done. But of course, he's come too far at this point. He's effectively killed himself how many times over? 30, 40?
Well, plus, he doesn't have to worry about that now because, he thinks he's made it off scot-free, and he's not going to be doing this anymore because and of course, that's moments before he meets his own demise. And I love sitting in the theater. This was so thrilling. The fact that when Frederick is, being walked towards his execution, he turns to the guard, and which, by the way, Guilty mentioned earlier we have the scene with the guard where, he, chains him up by the foot, and, which is so great. That's one of those purely entertaining moments. And so we have that same guard, and he just leans into him and he goes, "Are you watching closely?" And the look on the guard's face. And I remember sitting there oh shit, what is he gonna do? There's got to be something planned. What did I miss? Something is gonna happen. And I'm just waiting with bated breath and breathing really heavily. I'm like, what am I not seeing? And again, I had not the slightest inclination of what the reveal was going to be about Fallon. And and to have, then to hear, Borden or Frederick, his final words be just slightest whisper, abracadabra.
Yes.
And then cutting right to the gunshot, and then, Angier falls to the ground, and, the ball goes rolling, a hand picks it up, and then his figure stands up, takes off the hat, and it's Borden, and you're like, what the? It's how did he do it? And then we get the whole story about how he, because then we hear Angier goes, "That's when my brother,"
which I always thought was too easy, but. Yeah. And the movie lulls you into it as well, because even if you specifically had your suspicions, they deploy it perfectly. A movie about magicians is going to have a line like that at some point. They save it for the most optimal, point and use it differently than you would believe based on the trailer. But the idea that basically Borden has we might have gotten the idea that, okay, Borden probably is using a double in some way, but it kind of fades into the background a bit because we then become so fixated on what Angier is doing and the whole mess that he's gotten himself into in his kind of dark turn, where he, is clearly up to something no good with hiring blind stage hands and not wanting Cutter backstage. And you're like, okay, something's off.
It's done to such great effect. It's so creepy with the lightning and the sound and then there's flashes of light and you got these blind stage hands and like the whole thing is so damn creepy.
Yeah, it's beautifully shot. This movie was, I believe it was nominated for 2 Oscars, Best Cinematography and Best Art Direction. And originally, when I saw it, I was like, it was great cinematography. Did it win? It should win. Then I went and checked the movie that did win. You know what won? Pan's Labyrinth. So I was like, yes, I that's like an all-time favorite for me. So I will.
Even that was actually an upset because a movie that was the front runner to win was Children of Men.
Yep. With the famous one take. Yeah.
Yeah. Sadly, I don't think The Prestige was ever done.
Well, I mean, again, I'm okay with that. It was up these 2 categories. I was up for cinematography and art direction. It was
it's funny.
It lost to Pan's Labyrinth for both.
I do remember that year because I was like, because I was so excited about the fact that Pan's Labyrinth was up for some Oscars. The Prestige was up for some Oscars. I think even The Illusionist got a couple nominations.
It was also in the cinematography category.
And Children of Men. I was so excited about those movies that I was like, I don't even care about the main races. I was just so excited for the categories that these other films had gotten in. I got grouchy about the fact that Pan's Labyrinth ended up winning or losing Best Foreign Language Film, but who cares about that now? But
I have not actually seen The Lives of Others that it lost to. Apparently, it's very good, but Pan's Labyrinth is like a top 5 all-time movie for me, so it would have to be pretty good.
It's a really good movie, but it's not Pan's Labyrinth good.
Yeah, but Pan's Labyrinth did win 3 Oscars: cinematography, art direction, makeup. This was actually the year, I believe, linking it back to Scorsese. This was the year that The Departed won, and Scorsese finally got his Oscar. So that was the big narrative. But I'm glad that The Prestige was represented here, because it deserved to be.
But So anyway, gorgeous movie. That whole final exchange between the Angier and Borden is just. That's why I said earlier, like Angier has fallen so much and done so many absolutely wretched and horrible things that by that point he doesn't have your sympathies, but you understand, And so when he gives that final speech before he dies, just about you never understood why we did it, and the world is, I forget the exact words he uses.
I have the quote, and it's actually a beautiful quote.
Yeah, go ahead.
So Borden says, you went halfway around the world, you spent a fortune, you did terrible things, really terrible things, Robert, and all for nothing. And Angier says, for nothing, and Borden says, yes, for nothing. And then Angier says, you never understood why we did this. The audience knows the truth. The world is simple. It's miserable, solid, all the way through. But if you could fool them, even for a second, then you can make them wonder. And then you got to see something really special. You really don't know? It was the look on their faces. And that's it's such a great speech, because that's actually something that makes you a little bit more sympathetic to Angier in the moment, because you're like, yes, we do actually, he's right. He really does want to capture an essence of magic as best he can and revel in that, and but the idea is that really if you're going to do that, it's an idea that should be shared, trying to create magic for others. He's not interested in the magic he's creating for the joy it brings other people. It's for the joy it brings him in that moment to get that reaction and bask in that wonder and that adulation and that prestige. And that's when you start to realize, recognize again that like he did all of this just for that, and that basically and that beautiful speech becomes a distillation of what Borden effectively is like. Cool motive, still murder. But yeah, it's a great final beat for his character, because to the extent that we can understand Angier's actions, that really like tells us everything we need to know about this guy, who we now know was Lord Caldlow, this aristocrat who decided that he would, create a new identity for himself so that he could practice clearly the thing that he loved and became obsessed with, magic, and this creation of the moment of wonder that he talks about. But wherever he lost his way, whether it was at the beginning or somewhere along this journey that we've just witnessed, he clearly did lose his way. And that's, to the point that he did the unspeakable things that finally caused him to get his hands dirty and ended up with tanks of his dead clones lining the hallways, and in this burning theater underlying the ruin of all his ambition, and the simple fact of like when he was taunting Borden, and he's like, whatever your secret was, that he tears up because he doesn't care. And like, if you just taken a look in that moment, you might not have been in that motivation, because Borden was ready to give up the game in that moment to try to help save his daughter, or rather, it's Albert's daughter.
It's such a great line. Whatever your secret was, you have to admit, mine is better.
Yes.
It's such a great, I won, moment, but it's, what you don't know and could have known if you had just read it. But yes.
No, and Guilty Undertaker, they posted in the chat a while ago, is this the only film that Hugh Jackman has played a villain? I don't think it's the only one. It's the one that and again, whether or not you think Angier's fully a villain or just kind of a dark character, it's up to your interpretation. He clearly does villainous things. I also know he plays a villainous character in that other Woody Allen magician movie I mentioned, Scoop, but again, I haven't seen that one. So, in this movie, he just, like, once he becomes Lord Caldlow, that's when you realize, oh, this guy's just an utter bastard, right?
Well, and it's so interesting that, then it's revealed that this, like, not only, like, is it revealed that this is actually what his name was, this is who he was, before, but he has, not unlike Borden at all. He's, although with Borden, it's two brothers pretending to be the same person. With Angier, he actually adopts a different persona, whether he's being Angier or, or Lord Caldlow. And it's just, even when he's talking to Cutter, he adopts this, upper class, it's like, you bastard, you. Oh God. Yeah.
Just the simple fact, like, once he puts on that more aristocratic accent and those airs, it lends itself more towards his, kind of cold, distant portrayal. Because for the most of the movie, he's actually, even though we know that he's British, he's actually putting on an American accent for the most part. And Borden even tells him, like, well, you're going to have to go back to America now and, like, revel in your failure there. And of course, Angier does go on the quest there, but it's not home for him. It's the place where his obsession truly, crystallizes into the thing that will destroy him. So yeah, it's a dark, dark, dark revelation, and that
That's another reason. That's another reason why we think he's the hero, because he speaks with an American accent.
Oh yeah, it's Star Wars rules. You know, the Rebel Alliance all have an American accent, other than maybe like Mon Mothma in Return of the Jedi, and the villain, the British Imperial officers are all like British thespians. So.
Yeah. Oh, and I love the juxtaposition of the final moments of this movie. I talked about earlier when we get the repeating of the each magic trick has three parts or acts, and then when he says it's not enough to make something disappear, you have to bring it back, and the way the music comes in, which by the way, the score for this film is just brilliant. It's very subtle, but it's just amazing. And that's such an uplifting emotional moment where you get the reunion of father and daughter, and then you get the nod between Borden and Cutter, but then the voiceover of Cutter continues for the last bit, and the whole, now you're looking for the secret, but you won't find it. Because, of course, you don't really want to know. You don't really want to work it out. You want to be fooled. And then it just shows dead body in the tank.
No, that which they hadn't shown until exactly that moment, which those final moments, the uplifting and then the transition back into the dark belly of the theater that's now burning, very like hellish kind of imagery, and Cutter's voiceover, and specifically the way that Michael Caine like does that cadence, because it's the same speech he does at the beginning of the movie, but here he kind of plays it differently. He puts the emphasis in different spots, and specifically the moment that from when I saw it the first time and like just was left just like with my jaw kind of like on the floor was the way that they structure the approach to the final shot, with where, as you say, he's building up now you're looking for the secret, but you won't find it because of course you're not really looking. You don't really want to work it out. You want to be fooled. And that it's fixated in that moment on Angier drowned and dead in the tank, and then the smash cut to black off that, and you're like,
and what is a completely like unexpected and not it wouldn't have, I've always said it wouldn't have been my choice for the music for the end credits of this movie, but the song that almost feels out of place, but what it does is it creates this very unsettled feeling. As the movie ends, like there's this dissonance that's created when all of a sudden there's like you've had this shocking moment and then cut to like a piece of music that feels slightly out of place. I've never quite decided whether I like that choice or whether I would have preferred a piece of original score over the credits for the film, but I think it's actually quite effective in making you feel very unbalanced. And
and in a movie that's so immaculately crafted, you have to think that Christopher Nolan had a reason for doing that. I agree, like just based on my own personal sensibilities, I think I would have preferred it to kind of be a more like quiet, like ethereal point of like music over the credits, because I find that it's honestly one of the best cut to blacks I've ever seen in a movie. It's so well done, and I really kind of wanted to just sit with it in the moment and like kind of just appreciate just how effectively unsettling it was. And then the music kind of doesn't let you sit there. It kind of like keeps you jarred and unsettled. It kind of reminds me in a way about Game of Thrones reference, the scene where Jaime loses his hand, and then they cut to the kind of rollicking Hold Steady rock song, which I remember certain people weren't happy with at the time. I like that.
I wasn't even sure how I felt about it, honestly. But I certainly was not among the people who reacted wildly over the top about it, but it does, like, it feels uncomfortable,
Yeah.
you know, and I think that, yeah, it's, I mean, with a film that is so immaculately crafted, and knowing Christopher Nolan, you know, I have no reason to believe that that wasn't exactly, you know, what he wanted for, you know, for the end of the film. So ultimately I'm fine with it, even though it probably wouldn't have been my personal choice, but it does, like I said, it does create this uneasy feeling, you know, as you're walking out of the theater.
Yeah, it's so I personally will, you know, that's more of a taste question. It's not, definitely not a situation where I feel like I'm like, I wish the movie hadn't done that. It's more just like, I might not have done that way, but then again, I would not have made a movie anywhere close to as great as this one was. So off, all power to you, Christopher Nolan. It doesn't detract from the ending of the movie for me. It, like, again, that final shot, those final words, the smash cut to black, all of that is like pitch perfect. And then it's just, you know, into the credits, and I'm like, okay, you know. But it's, again, the entire final scene is just awesome.
Yeah. Oh God. And just what I love about the scene and that final reveal, it's like, it's not even like a shock reveal of like you don't know what you're gonna see, but it's going along with this idea of you don't want to work it out. You know, you want to be fooled, like, you know what is about to be revealed, but it's the terror at looking at it and not shielding yourself from it. And yeah, it is like one of the most disturbing ends to a movie I've ever seen, and so brilliant.
It's something you just you feel like, as you said, this movie, I wouldn't necessarily call it a horror movie, but it definitely has horror elements to it. And one of the famous staples of horror is what you don't see is always tends to be scarier than what when you ultimately see it. But the moment of the reveal can be the most terrifying of all. So when they don't fixate on the dead Angiers in the tank until the very end of the movie, and that's the moment where it's effectively the movie bringing the hammer down. It's not a jump scare, but it functions similarly, of like, we've kind of been showing you and showing you and showing you and showing you, like, through various subtle ways, like just how twisted and dark and terrifying what this guy was doing is. And here's the moment when we're actually just going to show you, and then we're going to cut to black, and we're just going to leave you with that. So very effective.
Oh God. Oh, really quick, I wanted to shout out a couple other names which didn't come up, just a couple, because we covered most of the cast. An English actor named William Morgan Shepherd, who played Merritt, the owner of the theater, who they go to multiple times for their show, who kicks them out once, you know, Borden sabotages, you know, their show. And then the great Daniel Davis, who plays the judge, presiding over Borden's trial. A lot of people know him from Star Trek: The Next Generation, where he played Moriarty. I know him from, I forget the character's name, but he played the butler on the sitcom The Nanny, which he was hilarious on. So I thought that was quite cool when I saw him in this. Yeah, no, I think we mentioned just about the rest of the cast.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'll just shout out again, just because we did mention his name several times, but this is a great Michael Caine performance. You know, he's been in a lot of
Oh
Christopher
yeah.
Nolan movies, and you know, he's in all three Batman movies: Batman Begins, Dark Knight, Dark Knight Rises. He's in Interstellar. He's in Inception. He has a voice role in Dunkirk. He's in Tenet, but this is actually one of the movies where like he has more of like he's kind of really like a moral compass throughout the movie. And so it's not just like, and it's the second movie he did with Christopher Nolan, Batman Begins being the first. So it's really kind of, he isn't just here because, you know, Michael Caine's always going to be in a Christopher Nolan movie. He's here because this was the role, he was the actor for this part. And you can tell listening to the behind the scenes commentary just how impressed Michael Caine is with Christopher Nolan's filmmaking prowess. And Christopher Nolan's clearly impressed with Michael Caine, and rightly so, because Cutter throughout this movie, like you can tell that this guy, he is very much, you know, a workaday kind of engineer who just wants to keep doing his craft. He didn't sign up for all of this insanity. And he gets a kind of very definitive moment of, you know, taking Caldwell to task, of like getting to choose his side. And he's also sympathetic. And we don't learn a lot about like his backstory or his inner life, but Michael Caine clearly just shows us throughout the movie what, like, just how much this guy knows about the world and human nature, and how he can, you know, perform his art. And the fact that he does not lose himself is a testament to him and his character. And it's the kind of actor that you need, and the kind of role you really need an established British thespian to give that heft. And man, does he, because you know, he opens the movie, he closes the movie, he really feels like our guide throughout the process, from the magic trick and the structure to like the reveal at the end. And it's a wonderful performance. I honestly think it's one of his best. He's had such a long, distinguished career. I won't say it's like one of his best performances ever, but he is great in this movie, and rightly.
Yeah, I would argue that I think that this is like, because he really only has like, out of his performances in Christopher Nolan's movies, he really only has like two meaty parts, and that's in this and in the Batman films. With the other films, he has a bit to do in Interstellar, but those are the characters that he really gets. These two characters are the ones that he gets to really sink his teeth into, and I think that this may be my favorite, you know, of those roles. And I mean, I've been it's funny because there's actually quite a lot of his older films which I probably still need to go back and check out, because I think my my earliest memory of Michael Caine was The Muppet Christmas Carol,
which he is also great in.
Yeah.
So.
Which I would admit, I don't know, there are probably some people who would roll their eyes at this, but I think it's one of his finest performances. But yeah, no, he's just utterly sublime in this, because as you said, he is like, he is the moral compass in this. We also mentioned how Tesla is a bit of a moral compass, but he also builds the machine. Yeah. So Cutter does feel like the one who's like, no, I'm not going to go down this path. And he certainly would not help Angier in the last act if he knew like what Angier was actually planning. So, yeah, no, it's just, I don't know what to say, because he just makes it look so easy. He's, you know, he's just one of those actors that you especially when he's playing a role like this, you just immediately love him when he steps onto screen. I just love the way he delivers lines. Like, early on in the film when, they're having the argument amongst themselves about, Borden is talking about, the magician they're, doing the show with, and, how boring he is and stuff like that. And just the way Michael Caine delivers a line like, I suppose you have such a trick, it's it's just like he's one of those actors you can tell he has so much fun, doing his job, and it's just he's always a pleasure to watch.
Yeah, no, I love his performance in this movie. I love his performance in all of the movies I've seen him in, because Christopher Nolan, he is the definitive Alfred for me, partially because the Christopher Nolan Batman. I know. We don't need to get into that. I will say I saw the Dark Knight trilogy before I saw the 1989 and 1992 Batman Returns. So Michael Caine came first in my mind, and like that the scene that he has in The Dark Knight Rises where he's like pleading with Bruce not to go back out there is like, it means a lot to me in that moment. So I'm not no disrespect to the great Michael Gough, but I just like it that's an important kind of performance to me. But I do think that as a complete character, because Alfred, he is more of a loyal butler, I do think Cutter is probably his best performance in like beginning to end in a Christopher Nolan movie. So it's great.
Michael Gough, it's like you just like you can't beat that for me. That'll be a conversation for another time.
We'll have to talk about some more Batman movies on this channel. I'm down to do that.
Just because, and it's so funny because if we can digress for a second, I've had conversations with other people about like how they view Batman, as like, what kind of style their preferred Batman films have, and like which actors they prefer, and I am like so firmly entrenched in like the Tim Burton Gothic style that like for me that era of Batman, between the two Tim Burton films and Batman the Animated Series, like that is my sweet spot of Batman always. And so unfortunately everything else that's come after has to compete against what I view as perfection. And but that said, like there's no denying the power of Christopher Nolan's interpretation of Batman, and it's so totally different that I get it. But now that we've had that, like, Batman movies now have to work really hard to like overcome that bias that I have, and I have to say Matt Reeves did a really great job doing that with the Batman.
We talked about that on this channel with a fantastic Alfred scene where Andy Serkis was playing.
Andy Serkis, yeah.
Which
it's funny going back to these days, and and even before that, the days of Lord of the Rings. I never would have thought we'd have gotten to the point where Gollum was playing Alfred.
Acting is a wonderful thing, but yeah, basically Alfred Pennyworth, great character. For me, I hear you on the sweet spot. For me, like the Dark Knight trilogy was very important to me cinematically, but I also, in my Batman loving heart, everything is still chasing the animated series and Mask of the Phantasm. That movie, I love it so much. I would love to talk about that one on this channel. But it's a great, and that actor, I believe it's Ephraim Zimbalist is the guy who voices Alfred. But regardless, we will get there. And I just wanted to say, in terms of the great Michael Caine phenomenal performance that really like helps this movie. Like you don't even realize just how important he is to the movie until he bookends it, and then you're like, he did this movie wonders in terms of its, you know, the credit and the craftsmanship that he gave to a movie like this, and I'm very glad we got to have this performance, and that he continued to work with Christopher Nolan up until his retirement. As we joked on the Oppenheimer stream, if he hadn't retired, I'm pretty sure Christopher Nolan would have found a role for him in Oppenheimer. But I believe he's retired now, and you know, Godspeed to him, because he's one of the best.
Well, at least I feel okay about his retirement, because you know. Yeah. He is, you know, up there in years, and if he feels like that's enough, like, then who might argue he's left an incredible legacy. It's not like, you know, not that this actor hasn't also left an incredible legacy. He certainly has, but like the whole thing with Daniel Day-Lewis, I'm like, come on, Daniel, you got some more in you. Just wait a couple more years and then come on back.
I think
anything, I mean, there's loads of details in this movie that we could have covered, but you know, we already we passed the 3-hour mark. No room for everything, but is there anything that we didn't get to that you wanted to highlight before we
I mean, yeah, it's such a dense, thematically rich movie that, like, we've talked about so many of the themes and ideas: obsession, secrecy, sacrifice, duality, total devotion to art, grief, loss, science and magic, class, you know, prestige, rivalry, you know, it's like, and all of this in a movie that itself, it's 2 hours and 15 minutes long. Like, there's barely a wasted second in it. And like, you know, not that Christopher Nolan is averse to a sprawling 3-hour epic. You know, see our discussion of his 3-hour masterpiece. I feel confident saying that word definitively.
I know, I was surprised at the running time of this when I looked at it before turning it on today. I was like, I could have sworn this was like at least like a 2.5 hour movie, but it's for the amount of stuff that it packs in, it's actually surprisingly, on the shorter side.
It's a dense movie that doesn't feel dense, because there's just so many layers to thematically, narratively. It's, as we said, it's a movie that rewards rewatches. It's a movie that knowing the twist doesn't lessen its value. If anything, it enhances it. So that's why, to kind of bring it back to our discussion of Christopher Nolan, its place in Christopher Nolan's filmography, once you get to the stage where Nolan is at in his career, where he is likely, rightly, about to win an Oscar, several Oscars for his kind of magnum opus in Oppenheimer. Hopefully, nominations come out on Tuesday. I'm expecting Oppenheimer to get a lot, and it will deserve them all, including for Christopher Nolan. But when people look back at his filmography, I do think Oppenheimer stands as probably his masterpiece. The Dark Knight is obviously in a seminal moment for movie-going history generally. But when people look back at his entire body of work, The Prestige is going to be a film that a lot of people are like, you know what? That was probably one of his best movies. And, at first, Blanche might be like, really? But then when you actually watch it, you're like, oh, yeah. Yeah, no, this is a filmmaker who is perhaps not hit his peak yet, but is on top of this game. We are watching like a master at work here, and it's just cool to go back and appreciate that even more in retrospect. As you say, this movie now being, what, 18 17 or 18 years old?
18 years old, yeah. I do want to say something that I was thinking about earlier today that I wanted to mention, and it's a good time to bring it up as we're talking about the fact that Christopher Nolan is probably about to have his big sort of moment in the spotlight with, you know, a big show at the Oscars for Oppenheimer, is that I know there's a lot of despair about where the film industry is at, and rightly so. You know, it's, you know, the theaters are kind of overcrowded with, you know, franchises, and even though I love a lot of those franchises, I don't think you can really deny that it's, you know, it'd be nice to have not just smaller, like small films, but also like, you know, mid-budget dramas and, you know, more stuff like we used to see. But when people want to despair about that, I also look at somebody like Christopher Nolan, who, I mean, before Batman Begins, he had only done, you know, well, he'd done his small independent film following, and then, you know, he had Memento and Insomnia, which were two, you know, dramas. Insomnia was more of the studio picture, as we talked about. Memento was very much, you know, an independent film. Then he comes in with Batman Begins, and then starting really with The Prestige, he's able to somehow hoodwink the studios into letting him do these incredibly ambitious, expensive, mind-bending, you know, extraordinary pieces of cinema shot on film. Even now, you know, shot on, you know, Oppenheimer is shot on, you know, with a lot of scenes in IMAX, and even the stuff that's not IMAX is still shot on like 65 millimeter. And just creating these classic pieces of cinema that, you know, are intelligent and just beautifully constructed, and doing them in a way that they appeal to mass audiences somehow. He has like really cracked the system in a way that, like, you know, maybe it's easy for some people to be like cynical about him as a director or whatnot. I certainly will never be one of them. I think he's one of our greats, and I think the fact that especially early on the directors were resistant to like giving him nominations in that best director category might have been a little bit of professional jealousy going on.
Yeah.
Just saying. Because he has just, you know, what he has managed to accomplish and to do, it's like it's just this ultimate, you know, victory, you know, over this notion that you can't make like really compelling, interesting cinema. And the way he does it, the fact that it's so rooted in the history of cinema, with, you know, his films look like they're timeless, you know, because they don't feel like, and part of that is the way they're filmed, you know, they're shot on film and not digital, but it's also the techniques he uses. And, you know, because you could, if you didn't know what year his films were made, you'd be hard pressed to really nail it down, you know, over the last, say, 20 or 30 years, at least. So I just continue to be amazed that he somehow found his way to, you know, to beating the system somewhat, to where he gets to make movies, really great films his way, and in a way that not only, you know, gets great, you know, reviews from critics, but they're beloved by audiences. They do great numbers at the box office. It really is not a small feat, and that's why, you know, like, he will without a doubt go down as one of, you know, the greatest directors of all time. So
Yeah, no, well said to absolutely all of that. He is my favorite working director for a reason, because 12 films into his filmography, he has just always managed to find a story that I found so enriching and compelling, and telling it in a way that just feels like you're watching that master craftsman at work. And it's, if and when he probably wins his Oscar this year, it, like, sometimes Oscar wins feel very momentary, of like, that was the film of that year, or sometimes it feels like, oh, this is the career win, where it's like, this might not be the auteur's best work, but it's the right time, it's his time, we're going to work our time, we're going to reward them now. And with Nolan, one of the reasons it feels so triumphant is because not only is Oppenheimer, I think, the best movie of the past several years and rightly deserving of all its acclaim, but it is also very much feels like his time and his to be recognized for the master craftsman that he is. And that includes all of his previous work, including this movie, The Prestige, which has only grown in estimation over time. So it really feels like this is the moment when we are collectively as a culture recognizing that we are witnessing like a master at work here. And the greatest part of all is he's not done. He's got more movies like this in him because, as you pointed out, he has a unique power to tell stories like this that can and figure out a way to make them commercially viable in a way that few directors have. And we need that because this is the kind of artwork that we want to see rise to the top of, the cinematic art form. And he's doing it. He's doing it. So I'm just so grateful for, this, for him continuing to do the work that he does, and particularly being able to go back and appreciate all of his films in their time and now, because this movie, just having watched it last night after having not seen it for maybe like a year or two, I'm just like, oh, it's even better than I remembered it. So he has the goods, and I'm just I feel very, very privileged to be living in his time, shall we say.
Well, it goes back to what I said, was it's so wonderful to have a director like this whom I can say, like, I remember seeing Memento. I remember when, like, that, that Christopher Nolan at his beginning, and just watching, him just, for lack of a better term, flower into the director that we have now. And yet all of his films leading up to this have just been so incredible. What you said about the Oscar is about how it feels like earned, and this is like, and it feels like it's, the right movie to reward him. It pisses me off because it's stuff like this that lulls me back into the whole Oscar bullshit.
Nominations come out on Tuesday. I'm going to be waking up for it.
I know. It's like I'm sticking to my guns. I'm not watching the ceremony this year, and I'll just watch highlights after the fact. But it is stuff like this that it's like, every once in a blue moon they actually get something, right. And I have to remind myself that this stuff doesn't really matter. As a recognition of actual, quality work, but you can't help but still get excited when people you like are rewarded.
and rewarded for doing work that like feels like nobody else could do. Because one of the other great things about Christopher Nolan is the fact that he is unashamed of being able to do genre films. He doesn't treat them as lesser. He treats a movie like this that has scientific fantasy elements, including a machine that clones people, as like the most as like serious cinematic art, and so we buy it.
By the way, I did see something on social media. Somebody posted you know, I think it was on Tumblr. Then somebody said, well, you know, get ready to watch the Prestige, a movie about two competing magicians. Why is this listed under science fiction?
Oh, just you wait.
Yeah. Okay, let's wind this thing up because this is ridiculous. We you know,
We
we've
knew
gone
this was going
well over 3 hours. Yeah, but we got to start working ourselves down. Like every once in a while, going over 3 hours is fine, but we're making it like every single week. Anyway, so yeah, just an absolute masterpiece of a film. I was really looking forward to this one because you know, it's such an interesting film to talk about, um, and yeah, just thank you, Jared. It's, you know, I've really been enjoying, you know, our conversations that we've had, and this is just the type of movie that, you know, it's great to really sink our teeth into and discuss. Anyway, so next week we will be moving over in a very different direction towards Mr. Martin Scorsese and his film Hugo. So I once again plead with you know, everybody to, if you haven't seen the movie, please do check it out, because I'm sure it'll be a good conversation next week, and all the more interesting because you will be watching it for the first time, Jared. And I'm very interested to see what your thoughts are.
I'm looking forward to it, and thank you, John. This was great. I love this movie. I love being able to talk about it with you, and let's keep it going, man. We've got a lot of other, you know, great stuff coming up, so I'm looking forward to it.
And I love that we are now fully back into the swing of things. We will be taking the week of the Super Bowl off, but it is nice to more or less be doing this every week now, because we had a couple months there where, man, it was really disjointed. but yeah, so yeah, come back next week for Hugo, and then in future weeks we'll be having discussions on the Mask of Zorro and the Rings of Power with some wonderful guests. Thank you, everybody who tuned in throughout the stream, and thank you, Guilty Undertaker, for sticking with us all the way to the end. To 3 hours, 3 hours and 17 minutes. And anybody who's coming to this later, if you haven't subscribed, please do so. And yeah, hope you guys enjoyed the discussion. And thank you once again, Jared. Anything you want to say before we sign off?
I'm just going to close with a single word, the only word that you can end a movie discussion of a movie like this on. So if you want to have ready to cut us to black, I think you know what word I'm going to say. Abracadabra.